Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Today I have a bunch of new stories for you. Let's start right away with the first one. It is titled, "My Fiancé Ambushed Me with a Prenup at a $1.90 steak dinner." Her friends applauded. Her lawyer smiled. I closed the folder, stood up, and said, "Enjoy your legal buffet." Next day, her attorney called. "What did you do with your estate?" It was already gone. Have you ever noticed how wealthy people have this uncanny gift for turning a perfectly enjoyable dinner into some kind of hostage situation? I'm talking about the type of person who can't appreciate a beautifully cooked steak without attaching some kind of emotional price tag to it. That's exactly what went down on what was supposed to be a romantic evening overlooking San Francisco Bay. Except romance had apparently clocked out early, and no one had bothered to give me a heads up. We were at Swan, one of those rooftop spots where the waitstaff speaks in whispers and the wine menu requires both a translator and possibly a second mortgage. Rachel had insisted on the place, said it was perfect for a celebration, which in hindsight should have been my first warning sign, because in my experience, when someone tells you something is perfect, they're usually about to make it the exact opposite. The view was breathtaking, I'll give her that. The bay spread out like liquid silver beneath the setting sun. Sailboats drifting along without a care in the world, which made exactly one of us. The table was packed with her friends, and I use that term loosely, because half of them I'd never laid eyes on before that night, and the other half I'd crossed paths with once at some charity gala where everyone pretended to care about endangered wildlife while sipping champagne that cost more than actual conservation efforts. There was Bethany, who worked in private equity, which I'm pretty sure translates to I shuffle rich people's money around and act like it's complicated. There was James, whose entire identity lived inside his watch collection. And then there was the lawyer. Harold Dempsey, Esquire, attorney at law, guardian of assets, destroyer of good energy. The man waltzed in wearing a tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car, sporting one of those smiles that says I bill $800 an hour, and right now I'm billing you just for thinking about me. He settled into our table like he'd received a formal invitation to Thanksgiving dinner, which struck me as bizarre immediately, because who brings their attorney to a romantic dinner? Apparently, Rachel does. I was halfway through my steak, a glorious $90 cut of beef that had been raised on organic grass and probably daily motivational speeches, when Rachel tapped her champagne flute with one of those tiny dessert spoons. The whole table went quiet, and that is never a good sign. In my experience, when wealthy people stop talking and start listening, somebody's about to get played. And the smart money said that somebody was me. "Before we lock in the wedding plans," Rachel said, her voice carrying across the table with the confidence of someone who'd been rehearsing this in front of a mirror for days. "There's just one small thing we need to take care of." She smiled at me like she'd just announced we were adopting a puppy. Everyone else at the table was smiling too. Nodding along like this was some charming romantic tradition I'd somehow missed in all my years on Earth. That's when Harold the Destroyer reached into his briefcase, an actual leather briefcase that probably had its own liability coverage, and produced a folder. Not just any folder, but one of those high-end ones with an embossed cover and a little ribbon tie. He slid it across the table toward me like a Vegas dealer. Except in Vegas, at least you know going in that you're losing money. "It's just a prenuptial agreement," Rachel said, still smiling, still acting like this was perfectly routine, completely normal protocol for people in our position. Our position. I love that. As if we were both titans of industry instead of me being a guy who'd busted his tail to build a solid life, and her being someone who'd inherited enough money to purchase a small nation and was now apparently anxious I might try to take a piece of it. Her friends actually applauded. I am not joking. They clapped like she'd just solved a global crisis instead of insulting me in front of a room full of strangers. James said something about being smart, and Bethany nodded knowingly like she'd watched this film before and already knew the ending. I opened the folder, because what else was I supposed to do? Page 1 seemed reasonable enough. Boilerplate stuff about keeping separate property, fine. Page 2 started getting a little murky with language about income disparity management and asset protection protocols. By page 10, I was reading things like waiver of spousal support and limitation of community property rights, and my personal highlight, acknowledgement of financial inequality and acceptance of same. Let me translate that for you in plain English. Everything she owned would stay hers forever, and everything I owned would become a fun little footnote in legal history titled "Good luck proving that was ever yours." The document essentially said that if we ever divorced, I'd be entitled to whatever coins happened to fall out of her couch cushions, and honestly, I'd probably still have to fight her for those. I sat there reading clause after miserable clause, each one more offensive than the last, while Rachel watched me with this expectant expression, like she was waiting for me to say, "Oh honey, this is wonderful, where do I sign?" Harold the Destroyer sat with his hands folded, already mentally spending his consultation fee on a new boat or whatever lawyers buy when they're not busy dismantling people's dignity. Here's the thing about a moment like that. You've got two choices. You can explode, start yelling, flip the table, give everyone a scene they'll talk about for months. Or you can do something that costs you absolutely nothing, scares everyone in the room, and makes you the classiest person at the table, even while you're quietly coming apart inside. I went with option 2. I closed the folder with deliberate care, making sure the ribbon tie was neat. I picked up my cloth napkin, the expensive kind that probably cost more than my whole outfit, folded it precisely, and set it down beside what was left of my $90 steak. I stood up slowly, took one breath, and looked around at every expectant face at that table. "Enjoy your legal buffet," I said, my voice steady and calm, like I was commenting on the weather or pointing out a decent bottle of wine. Then I pushed my chair in, because even in moments of complete emotional wreckage, I have standards, and headed for the exit. The silence behind me was absolutely delicious. Nobody said a single word. Nobody moved to stop me. I could feel every set of eyes on my back as I passed other tables, walked past the horrified hostess, past the bewildered valet who'd probably never seen anyone leave Swan before dessert. And speaking of dessert, they were supposed to serve this fancy Italian tiramisu at $40 a slice. I'd been looking forward to it all week. But you know what tastes better than $40 tiramisu? Dignity. Self-respect. The understanding that you just removed yourself from a situation that would have eaten you alive for however many years it lasted. I walked out of that restaurant in what felt, in my head, like cinematic slow motion, even though in reality I was probably just walking at a completely ordinary human pace. But mentally, there was dramatic music playing and the lighting was hitting me just right. I was the lead character in a film who just delivered the perfect one-liner before the building went up in flames. Because here's what I figured out standing in that parking lot, with the smell of expensive food and cheap betrayal in the air: silence is a weapon. Probably the most powerful one you can own, because it costs nothing, terrifies everyone who encounters it, and when you deploy it correctly, when you just rise from your seat, say one perfect sentence, and walk out, you carry yourself with so much composure that even your enemies have to respect it. I got in my car, turned the ignition, and drove away from that rooftop restaurant without a single glance in the rearview mirror. My phone was already buzzing in my pocket, but I didn't touch it. Not yet. That could wait until I was back home, where I could enjoy whatever desperate messages were surely stacking up. The bay glittered behind me, and somewhere at that table, a group of people was probably sitting in stunned silence wondering what the hell had just happened. And Rachel, poor, calculated Rachel, was probably beginning to realize she'd shown her hand way too soon and lost the only game that mattered. When I pulled into my driveway about 20 minutes later, I still hadn't looked at my phone. It was buzzing like a trapped wasp against my leg, relentless and persistent, the way only someone who desperately needs you to validate their terrible decisions can manage. But I wasn't ready for that just yet. First, I needed to sit in my car and actually process what had happened, which is really just a fancy way of saying I needed to laugh until my ribs ached. The kind of laughter that rises up from somewhere deep in your chest. The kind that bubbles up when life becomes so genuinely absurd that your only real options are to laugh or to cry, and crying felt like giving Rachel too much credit. So I sat in my driveway, both hands still on the steering wheel, and I laughed. Not the bitter, hollow kind that people do when they're quietly furious. This was pure, genuine amusement. The kind you feel when you suddenly realize you've been living inside a sitcom for the past 6 months and you're only just now catching the laugh track. Think about it. I had just been ambushed at a high-end restaurant with a prenuptial agreement that essentially said, "Thanks for showing up, here's your consolation prize of absolutely nothing." Surrounded by people who applauded like trained performers. Orchestrated by a woman I was supposed to marry in 3 months. Coordinated by a lawyer who probably went home that night and told his wife he'd had a productive evening. If that's not premium sitcom material, I honestly don't know what is. I half expected a studio audience to start cheering. After about 5 minutes of what probably looked like a full breakdown from any neighbor peeking out their window, I finally fished my phone out of my pocket. The screen was lit up like a Christmas tree. 12 missed calls. 23 text messages. And it wasn't even 10 o'clock yet. I scrolled through them with the detached curiosity of someone reading someone else's mail. Rachel had fired off 6 messages in rapid succession, each one a masterclass in damage control. "Marcus, where did you go? You're being dramatic. Can we please talk about this like adults? You didn't even let me explain. This is embarrassing." And finally, the one that made me actually snort out loud, "You're overreacting. Let's talk tomorrow." Overreacting. I love that. I'd been handed a legal document that basically said, "I don't trust you, I never will, And I wanted that documented in writing with a dozen coached witnesses present to applaud on cue. And I was overreacting because I didn't stick around to negotiate the terms of my own public humiliation. Sure, Rachel. That tracks. But there was more. Harold the Destroyer had also chimed in, and you could practically hear the billable hours accumulating with every word. Mr. Whitman, I understand tonight's presentation may have come as a surprise. Please know that all terms in the agreement are negotiable. We can arrange a private meeting to address any concerns. These structures are standard practice for couples with significant asset disparities. I remain at your disposal. Asset disparities. Nice touch. Very measured. Very let me insult you with professional vocabulary. I could picture Harold parked in his home office, mahogany decor, definitely pretentious, typing this out over a glass of scotch, feeling very pleased with himself for being so reasonable. I didn't respond to either of them. Not a single character. Because here's something I understood a long time ago, back when I was just starting out and dealing with people who assumed they could push me around. The most powerful thing you can do when someone expects a reaction is to give them absolutely nothing. Silence makes people unravel. It makes them second-guess every decision. It makes them fill the emptiness with their own worst fears. And best of all, it costs you nothing. Instead of typing a response, I went inside my house, my beautiful, fully paid-off house that I'd purchased with money I'd earned over years of actual work, and walked straight to my home office. I had some files to reorganize, because apparently this evening had turned into the kind of night where you reevaluate everything while still wearing a dress shirt that smells like good cologne and quiet devastation. I unlocked the cabinet and pulled out my estate files. I kept them color-coded because I'm organized, not because I'm a control freak. There was the green folder labeled active, current investments, live projects, things that needed attention. There was the blue folder labeled archive, closed deals, historical records, the financial equivalent of a photo album. And then there was the red folder. The red folder was labeled apocalypse. And it held exactly what you'd expect. Contingency plans for when everything falls apart. Divorce protocols, asset protection strategies, trust restructuring procedures, emergency contacts for attorneys who specialize in making problems disappear cleanly. I'd put this folder together years before Rachel ever came into my life, because I'd watched too many people get wiped out by trusting people who hadn't earned it. I pulled out the red folder, flipped it open, and grabbed a pen. At the top of a blank page, I wrote Rachel Abernathy in capital letters. Then I drew one long, satisfying line through it and moved her entire file from active to apocalypse. It felt good. It felt right. It felt like the kind of organized, quiet vengeance that Martha Stewart would fully endorse. While I was reorganizing my life, my phone kept buzzing. I glanced at it without picking it up, a skill I'd sharpened over years of dealing with people who treat their emergencies like they're automatically yours. More messages from Rachel. One from Bethany, probably trying to smooth things over. Two from numbers I didn't recognize, which meant her friends were now inserting themselves, which was just fantastic. I ignored every single one of them and went to the kitchen. You know what's genuinely great about living alone? You can eat whatever you want, whenever you want, and nobody's there to critique your choices or suggest you order something more sophisticated. I found a container of leftover Chinese noodles in the fridge, 3-day-old lo mein from that place down on Market Street that stays open until 2 in the morning and has absolutely no judgment about your life choices. I dumped the noodles in a bowl, hit the microwave for exactly 2 minutes and 30 seconds, and grabbed a bottle of wine from the rack. Not the nice stuff I saved for company or special occasions. I went straight for the $8 Cabernet from Trader Joe's, the one with the kangaroo on the label that probably tastes like mild regret and questionable decisions, but costs less than the appetizers I never got to finish at dinner. I poured myself a generous glass. And by generous, I mean almost to the brim, like someone who never learned about proper wine portions and doesn't particularly care. I sat down at my kitchen table with my lukewarm noodles and my budget wine and my freshly reorganized life. Then I raised my glass to the empty room and said out loud, like a total lunatic, here's to peace, quiet, and keeping my damn money. I took a sip. It tasted like victory, the kind produced by a winery that believes in quantity over quality. The noodles were a little soft. The vegetables had definitely seen better days. And here I was eating dinner alone at 10 on a Friday night after walking out of what was supposed to become a marriage. And you know what? It was perfect. Completely, genuinely perfect. Because here's the thing nobody warns you about when you walk away from something toxic, the immediate aftermath feels strangely peaceful. No more pretending. No more performing. No more waiting for the other shoe to drop, because the shoe already dropped, and you sidestepped it like a champion. My phone buzzed again. I glanced at the screen, saw Rachel's name, and smiled, because I knew exactly what was happening on her end. She was panicking. Harold was probably panicking. Her friends were definitely dissecting my exit in some group chat, analyzing every move like it was a reality show plot twist. And all of them were waiting for me to engage, to argue, to give them something to negotiate with. But I wasn't going to. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Maybe not ever. Because nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, destabilizes a control freak more than being ignored by someone who was supposed to fall apart. They expect outrage, confrontation, drama. They prepare for arguments and countermoves and emotional explosions. What they never prepare for is silence. Steady, deliberate, maddening silence. I finished my noodles, washed the bowl, and put my wine glass in the dishwasher like a functioning adult. Then I switched my phone to Do Not Disturb, walked to my bedroom, and slept better than I had in months. Tomorrow, Rachel was going to wake up to a completely different kind of problem. But tonight I was just a guy who'd eaten cheap noodles, drunk cheaper wine, and felt like the wealthiest man alive. I woke up the next morning feeling like I'd just had the most restorative sleep of my entire life, which is strange considering I'd technically blown up my engagement less than 12 hours earlier. But there's something about removing toxic people from your orbit that works better than any sleep aid on the market. 0 side effects. Maximum clarity. And you wake up with this remarkable sense of calm that no amount of money can replicate. It was Saturday, which meant 0 obligations and unlimited possibilities. I made myself a real breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, bacon that came out a touch crispier than intended, but whatever, I'm not a chef, and carried it out to my back porch. I've got a simple setup out there, a table, a couple of chairs, and a decent neighborhood view. Nothing like Rachel's Bayview penthouse, but it's mine, it's paid off, and nobody can strip it away from me with a legal document. I was sitting there sipping coffee and watching a duck waddle across my yard like it owned the property when I finally checked my phone. Still on Do Not Disturb, but the notifications were stacking up like digital tumbleweeds. 37 new messages. 19 missed calls. 3 voicemails I would probably never play, because voicemails are where self-respect goes to die. But here's the thing, I wasn't checking because I cared what Rachel had to say. I was checking because I was waiting to see exactly when the second bomb would go off. See, while everyone was fixated on the prenup drama, they'd completely overlooked a small financial arrangement Rachel and I had put in place about 6 months earlier. We'd opened what she called a joint vineyard account for our shared dream project. Rachel had this fantasy about owning a Napa Valley vineyard, one of those estates where wealthy people go to pretend they understand wine while sipping their own mediocre Cabernet and feeling deeply sophisticated. She'd sold me on it as our legacy, our retirement vision, our contribution to the agricultural arts. She had approximately 1 million romantic ways to describe what was essentially a very expensive hobby requiring 0 actual farming knowledge. We both contributed to the account, though in the interest of honesty, I'd put in significantly more, because I had actual liquid assets while her money was tied up in trusts and investments and whatever else people with inherited wealth do to keep it from sitting still. The account was meant for land acquisition, consultants, soil analysis, all that vineyard startup romance that sounds thrilling until you realize it's basically just throwing money at dirt and hoping grapes eventually show up. What Rachel hadn't noticed, because she never truly read the fine print on anything that didn't involve protecting her own interests, was that the account carried a custodial control clause. And the custodian was yours truly. Which meant 1 phone call and a few signatures was all it took for me to restructure the entire thing without her consent. And that's precisely what I'd done. On Thursday afternoon, right after Rachel texted me can't wait for our special dinner tomorrow night. With roughly 17 heart emojis, I'd walked into my bank and moved the entire vineyard account into an independent trust. Not a joint trust. Not a family trust. An independent, irrevocable, Marcus Whitman is the only person who matters trust. The timing was immaculate. She'd already scheduled her prenup ambush for Friday evening. I'd already executed my financial exit on Thursday afternoon. We were like 2 chess players who had no idea we were playing entirely different games. So there I was, Saturday morning, tossing crumbs to a duck who had absolutely no awareness it was witnessing the aftermath of financial warfare, when I imagined Rachel waking up in her penthouse. Probably pouring some organic, single origin, ethically sourced coffee that costs more per pound than actual gold, and deciding to check the vineyard account. Maybe she wanted to transfer some funds. Maybe she wanted to feel productive after the disaster of Friday night. Maybe she just wanted to look at the balance and remind herself things were fine. Whatever her reason, I knew the exact moment it happened, because my phone lit up with an incoming call from a number I recognized immediately. First Pacific Bank. Private Wealth Management Division. Rachel's bank. Our bank, technically, for the vineyard account. I let it ring. Instead, I topped off my coffee and waited. The duck quacked at something, probably judging everything about my choices. Ducks are more judgmental than people give them credit for. I tossed it another piece of toast. 3 minutes later, the same number called again. Then a text from Rachel arrived in all capitals. "Call me now." Full caps. That's how you know someone's morning has completely unraveled, when they abandon punctuation and just start screaming through their keyboard. I pictured the scene perfectly. Rachel, probably still in designer pajamas that cost more than most people's monthly rent, sitting at her kitchen island, laptop open, staring at a banking portal delivering very unwelcome news. The account was still there. The money was still there. But the access was absolutely gone. I imagined her calling the bank, getting transferred approximately 47 times because that's what banks do when the problem is too awkward to handle quickly. Until finally she reached someone in custodial services. Someone, let's call her Jennifer, because there's always a Jennifer in situations like these, who'd pulled up the account with the practiced efficiency of someone who deals with wealthy people's crises all day and has zero emotional investment in any of them. "Ma'am," Jennifer probably said, using that professionally pleasant voice that means she's reading from a script and absolutely does not care about your feelings. "I'm showing a change in custodial control on this account." "What kind of change?" Rachel would have asked, her voice climbing that ladder of panic that starts at confusion and ends at full hysteria. "The account has been moved under an independent trust structure," Jennifer would have explained, probably also scrolling her own email, checking her own calendar, because this was just another Tuesday for her. Mr. Whitman executed the restructuring on Thursday at 3:47 p.m. Thursday at 3:47 p.m. I love that timestamp. It was proof positive that I'd done this before the prenup disaster, which meant it wasn't retaliation. It was just smart planning. Proactive asset management. Me being responsible about my financial future. But it was a joint account, Rachel probably sputtered, because wealthy people always assume joint means they hold the power. It was a joint access account with custodial designation, ma'am, Jennifer would have clarified, and I'd bet real money she put some emphasis on that ma'am with the quiet satisfaction of a bank employee delivering bad news to someone who's been rude to service workers their whole life. The custodian holds the right to restructure as needed. The funds are now held in the Whitman Independent Agricultural Trust, registered under Federal Sovereign Shelter Status. Federal Sovereign Shelter Status. Lord, I love my lawyer. That was Malcolm's idea, my old friend from policy work who also happened to be a trust attorney with both a sharp mind and an appreciation for creative legal architecture. Putting the trust under Federal Sovereign Shelter Status didn't just protect the assets. It placed them in an entirely different legal universe. It would take an act of Congress to get anywhere near that money. "I need to speak to a manager," Rachel would have demanded, because when wealthy people don't get what they want from the first person, they escalate, like the world's most entitled customers. "Of course, ma'am. Let me transfer you to our senior custodial oversight department. Please hold." And then, my absolute favorite part, she would have been placed on hold. Probably listening to some inoffensive jazz designed to be just irritating enough to make you question whether the money in your account is worth this level of psychological wear. Meanwhile, I was still on my porch, still feeding my duck companion, still savoring the best morning I'd had in recent memory. My phone buzzed again. Another missed call from Rachel, then a text, "What did you do to the Vineyard account?" I finished my coffee, stood up, stretched like a man who is nowhere urgent to be and absolutely nothing to prove, and typed out a reply, gave it a new home. It needed stability. Short. Simple. Devastating. I hit send and turned my phone back to do not disturb. The duck looked at me with what I can only describe as approval in its small dark eyes. Or maybe it was just angling for more toast. Either way, I tossed it the last piece and went inside to brew another pot. Because here's the reality of moving money around before someone tries to take advantage of you, it's not vindictiveness. It's intelligence. Rachel had spent weeks carefully choreographing her prenup ambush, locking down every asset, sealing off every clause, making absolutely certain I couldn't touch a dime of hers. She brought a lawyer to dinner, for heaven's sake. She orchestrated a public performance with witnesses and champagne flutes. And she'd somehow forgotten that I was the person who'd helped write half the tax code she was trying to weaponize against me. That I'd spent 20 years learning how to protect assets, structure trusts, and move money in ways that would make a magician envious. That I didn't need scenes or high-priced attorneys or public confrontations. I just needed a Thursday afternoon, a skilled lawyer, and the discipline to read every single word of every document I'd ever put my name on. The sun was climbing higher. The duck had wandered off to bother someone else. And somewhere across the city, Rachel was probably still on hold, listening to smooth jazz, slowly understanding that she'd picked a fight with someone who was playing chess while she was still figuring out checkers. I smiled, poured another cup, and raised it to absolutely nothing. Because the best kind of victory doesn't require an audience. It doesn't need confrontation or raised voices or dramatic speeches. Sometimes it's just you, sitting on your porch, drinking average coffee, feeding a judgmental duck, and knowing that somewhere out there someone is having the worst Saturday of their entire life while you're having the best. By Saturday afternoon, Harold Dempsey, Esquire, attorney at law, champion of the wealthy, wearer of very expensive formal wear, had apparently concluded that silence wasn't working and decided it was time to bring out the heavy legal artillery. I know this because Malcolm rang me around 2 in the afternoon, laughing so hard he could barely form sentences. "Dude," he wheezed. "You have to hear this. Harold just filed an emergency injunction to freeze your estate." I was in my garage, sorting through tools I hadn't touched in 6 months, because apparently ending your engagement turns you into the kind of person who suddenly needs to alphabetize their socket wrench collection. An emergency injunction. What exactly is the emergency? That I have self-respect. "He's claiming you're concealing marital assets," Malcolm said, and I could hear papers shuffling. "Filed it with the county court about an hour ago. Wants everything frozen pending a complete financial disclosure and review. The man is really swinging here." "Let him swing," I said, setting down a hammer I'd been pretending to examine. "How long before reality punches him in the face?" "Oh, it already has," Malcolm said, and I could practically feel his grin radiating through the phone. "The county clerk is a woman named Kim Navarro. Young, sharp, doesn't take nonsense from anyone. She looked up your estate in the system and..." He paused for effect. "And?" I prompted, already knowing exactly what was coming. "She told Harold, and I'm quoting directly, 'Sir, this isn't under our jurisdiction. The estate has been moved under federal sovereign shelter status.'" Man, I wish I could have seen his face. I wasn't there, but I can picture it perfectly, and it is a beautiful image. I laughed, a full, unguarded laugh right there in my garage. Federal sovereign shelter status. Those 4 words were the most glorious combination in the English language at that particular moment. It meant my estate wasn't just shielded. It was in a completely separate legal dimension. Harold could file injunctions with the county court all day long, but it'd be like trying to serve a warrant in France using paperwork from the DMV. "What did he actually say?" I asked, settling onto my workbench like someone about to hear the greatest story ever told. "Well, according to Kim, who called me because she figured I'd enjoy the irony, he just stood there for a solid 30 seconds. Stone silent. Staring at the computer screen like it had personally betrayed him. Then he asked her to check again. She checked again. Same result. Then he asked if there might be a system error. She told him the system was working perfectly fine, but that his understanding of federal trust law might need some updating. She did not say that, I said, genuinely delighted. She 100% said that. Kim has a master's degree in legal administration and 3 years of dealing with pompous attorneys. She is completely immune to intimidation, Malcolm said, clearly savoring every detail. So Harold asks for her supervisor. The supervisor comes out, checks the same screen, tells him the exact same thing. Your estate is federally sheltered. Not their circus. Not their problem. I could picture every detail perfectly. Harold, in whatever obscenely expensive suit he'd worn for the occasion, standing in the county clerk's office, which is never a glamorous environment, fluorescent lighting, linoleum floors, the faint smell of old coffee and bureaucratic resignation. Being told by someone half his age that he'd just wasted everyone's afternoon, including his own. "So what happened next?" I asked, because this story was far too good to end there. "He left. But before he left, he asked Kim if she could at least tell him where the estate was registered. She told him she legally couldn't share that information without proper federal clearance, which he didn't have. Then she asked if there was anything else she could help him with, like maybe a pamphlet on federal trust law or directions to the nearest law library." "Absolutely savage," I said. "I like this Kim. Everyone likes Kim. She's already a legend in that office. Last year she made a guy cry for trying to file a fraudulent lien," Malcolm said, shuffling more papers. "Anyway, Harold walked out about 20 minutes ago. My guess is he's currently Googling what is federal sovereign shelter status and having a small existential crisis." "Good," I said, and I meant it. Not because I'm a cruel person. But because Harold had walked into that restaurant Friday night with his expensive folder and his rehearsed smile, fully expecting to steamroll me into signing away my dignity. He'd underestimated me. And now he was learning a very costly lesson about assumptions. Malcolm and I spent a few more minutes going over the specifics, the trust architecture, the federal registration, the various legal hoops someone would need to jump through just to get within range of my assets. It really was something elegant. Malcolm had helped me build this about 2 years back, long before Rachel was ever in the picture, because I'd learned early that the right time to protect yourself is always before you actually need it. After I hung up with Malcolm, I went back inside and made a sandwich. Turkey, Swiss, mustard, lettuce, nothing fancy, just fuel. I was standing at the counter eating it when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. But I had a fairly solid guess about who was on the other end. I answered on the third ring. Marcus Whitman speaking. Mr. Whitman, this is Harold. His voice sounded like someone who'd been gargling a mixture of gravel and disappointment. Harold Dempsey. I believe we need to have a conversation. Do we? I took a bite of my sandwich and chewed slowly. Let him hear it. Let him know I was completely unbothered. I attempted to file a protective order this afternoon regarding your estate, he said. And I had to give him some credit, he was still trying to sound professional even as I could hear the confusion simmering underneath. The county clerk informed me that your holdings are no longer subject to local jurisdiction. That's correct, I said pleasantly. Is that a problem? Silence. A long, thick silence. The kind that settles in when someone realizes they showed up to a gunfight carrying a butter knife. Mr. Whitman, may I ask what exactly you did with your estate? I smiled. That was the question I'd been waiting for. I gave it a passport, Harold. It needed a break from toxic entanglements. Another pause, even longer this time. I could practically hear the machinery turning in his head, trying to work out whether I was joking, whether this was some kind of code, whether there was a legal precedent for an estate having travel documents. I'm not entirely sure I follow, he finally said, which is attorney speak for please explain this to me like I'm 5, because I am completely at sea. It's really quite straightforward, I said, setting down my sandwich to give this conversation my full attention. My estate is now held in a federally registered independent trust with sovereign shelter status, which places it outside county court jurisdiction, state court jurisdiction, really any jurisdiction you can access without federal clearance, which I'm fairly confident you don't have. Federal clearance, he repeated, and I swear I could hear a portion of his soul quietly exiting through the phone. Mr. Whitman, this is highly unusual. Is it? I asked innocently. I thought protecting one's assets was standard practice for people with, what was the phrase you used, significant holdings. I'm just following your lead, Harold. Being smart. Being careful. Making sure everything is properly locked up. This isn't, he stopped himself, probably realizing that anything he said next would make him sound either incompetent or hypocritical. Miss Abernathy is very concerned about the vineyard account. I'd imagine so, I said cheerfully. That account is now part of the Whitman Independent Agricultural Trust, also federally registered. It's perfectly safe, perfectly protected, and completely inaccessible to people who ambush their partners with prenups over dinner. Mr. Whitman, Harold said, and his voice had shifted, from professional to something that sounded uncomfortably close to pleading, a register I'd bet he rarely used. Surely there's some arrangement we can arrive at. The prenuptial agreement is, as I mentioned, fully negotiable. We can schedule a meeting, work through your concerns. Here's the thing, Harold, I cut in, still pleasant but with an edge that could have scored glass. Last night, you sat at that table with your premium folder and your expensive tuxedo, and you smiled at me like I was someone who didn't understand what was happening. You helped orchestrate a public humiliation. You assisted Rachel in turning what should have been a private, adult conversation into a staged performance for her social circle. And now you're on the phone asking for a meeting, asking to negotiate, because you've finally realized that maybe, just maybe, you chose the wrong person to underestimate. Silence on his end. Deep, satisfying silence. So here's what I'm offering, I continued. You go back to Rachel and you explain that her financial advisor, which is me, by the way, in case she forgot, has restructured his holdings in a way that fully protects him from predatory legal arrangements. You tell her the vineyard account is secure and accounted for, just no longer within her reach. And you tell her that the next time she'd like to have a meaningful conversation about our relationship, she should try it without an audience and without legal counsel. Mr. Whitman, I really think. And Harold, I said, cutting him off one more time, because the momentum felt too good to slow down. You might want to revisit federal trust law. It's come a long way since your law school days. I'd hate for you to find yourself in this position again. Then I hung up. Mid-sentence. Which is objectively rude and subjectively the most satisfying thing I'd done all weekend. I imagined Harold sitting in his office, mahogany surroundings, law books arranged for appearance, staring at his phone like it had just said something unforgivable about his mother. I finished my sandwich, rinsed the plate, and went back to the garage. Found a level I'd been hunting for. A full set of drill bits I'd completely forgotten I owned. And a deep, settled peace that comes from knowing you just cornered a lawyer charging $800 an hour with nothing but the truth and a few well-timed words. My phone buzzed with a text from Malcolm. Harold just called me asking about federal trust law. I told him to Google it. I texted back, best Saturday ever. Found my missing level and dismantled a lawyer's confidence. Extremely productive day. Because that's exactly what happens when you play chess while everyone around you is still learning checkers. Eventually they look up from the board and realize they never had a shot. Harold had marched into the county clerk's office expecting to freeze my assets and force me back to the table. Instead, he discovered that my assets lived in another dimension entirely, his legal tactics were toothless, and the clerk had a better working knowledge of federal law than he did. And the best part of all, I'd accomplished this without raising my voice, losing my composure, or doing anything that could be held against me later. I was just a man protecting his interests, following the law, and ensuring that anyone who wanted to come after what was mine would have to work extremely hard for the privilege. The sun was beginning to lower, washing my garage in warm golden light. I put the tools away, closed everything up, and went inside to pour myself a glass of that $8 wine that was honestly getting better with every small victory. Sunday morning showed up wearing the kind of weather that makes you feel like the universe has finally taken your side. Clear sky, soft breeze, birds doing their thing without any agenda. The kind of morning that belongs in a commercial for retirement accounts or artisan coffee. I was back on my porch, which had apparently become my command center for watching the controlled demolition of my former relationship from a comfortable distance, when a courier van pulled up to the house. Now, Sunday morning courier deliveries are never casual. This isn't an Amazon package or a birthday card from your aunt. This is the kind of delivery that means someone paid a premium to make sure something reached you at a time when you weren't expecting it. It's a power move wrapped in convenience. The courier was a young guy, maybe 25, in a uniform just a little too polished for the job, a sure sign this was a premium service. He cross-checked his tablet, verified my address, then checked the tablet again, like he was confirming he had the right target for a very important operation. Marcus Whitman? He called out, even though I was standing right there on my porch holding a mug that said "World's Most Adequate Human," a Christmas gift from Malcolm 3 years back. "That's me," I said, stepping down to meet him. He handed over a large manila envelope, the reinforced, heavy-duty kind, with a weight to it that told you this was more than a few pages. "Need a signature, sir." I signed his tablet, thanked him, watched the van pull away. Then I looked at the envelope. No return address, which was classy in a vaguely threatening way. Just my name and address on clean printed labels. Professional. Impersonal. But I knew exactly what this was and where it had come from. I went back inside, refilled my coffee, and sat at the kitchen table. I could have ripped it open immediately, but where's the satisfaction in that? Let it sit. Let it wonder if I was anxious, curious, worked up. Let it learn that I open important documents on my own timeline, not anyone else's. After finishing my coffee and scrolling through a completely unrelated email from my dentist about an upcoming cleaning, which felt hilariously mundane given everything happening in my life, I finally picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was exactly what I expected, my estate declaration. The one I'd filed on Friday morning, roughly 6 hours before the prenup ambush, because I've always believed in getting ahead of problems rather than reacting to them. Every page was present, beautifully printed on heavy, high-quality paper stock. Every clause was legible. Every signature clear. Every notary seal perfectly pressed. But here's the detail that would have sent Rachel's blood pressure into dangerous territory. Her name didn't appear anywhere in the document. Not once. Not in the beneficiary section, not on the advisory committee, not in contingency planning, not even in the acknowledgments. It was as though she'd never existed in my financial world, which, as of Friday morning, was technically accurate. In her place, the primary trustees were listed as Grace Whitman, my sister, the woman who once told Rachel to her face that her shoes were trying too hard, and Malcolm Koss, my oldest friend and current favorite human being for helping me construct this legal fortress. The secondary beneficiaries included charities I actually cared about, a scholarship fund I'd been quietly supporting for years, and absolutely zero socially ambitious ex-fiancés with trust issues. I turned the pages slowly, savoring each one. There was the asset inventory, real estate, investments, the Vineyard Trust, even my small car collection, 2 vehicles, both fully paid off, and that counts for something. The distribution schedule. The tax strategy. The contingency protocols. Everything was there. Everything was solid. Everything was sealed. And then I arrived at the truly beautiful part, the exclusion clause. This was the section Malcolm had insisted on including, the one he called the nuclear option when we were drafting it. It read, in gorgeous legal language that probably cost him 3 hours and a bottle of very good scotch. Any individual who initiates, participates in, or facilitates adversarial legal action against the estate holder, including but not limited to prenuptial negotiations conducted in bad faith, public humiliation disguised as legal planning, or attempts to coerce estate restructuring through social pressure, shall be permanently barred from any and all benefits, considerations, or acknowledgments within this estate declaration, effective immediately upon such action and irrevocable in perpetuity. I read it 3 times. Each reading was better than the last. What this said in plain language: Rachel had excluded herself. Not me, her. By staging the prenup at dinner, by turning our relationship into a legal negotiation, by making a public spectacle out of protecting her money while trying to access mine, she had personally activated the one clause that locked her out permanently. She'd fired the gun herself. I hadn't had to do a thing except watch it happen. It was, as Malcolm would say, self-executing poetic justice. Or as I preferred to call it, consequences finally catching up to actions over a very nice meal. I pictured Rachel receiving her own copy of this document, because of course she would, that's how these things work. Probably sitting in her penthouse right now, pajamas still on, surrounded by half-empty coffee cups and the specific variety of panic that comes from understanding you've just maneuvered yourself into a permanent corner. She'd call Harold immediately, no question. What does this mean? She'd demand, voice climbing that desperate ladder from confusion toward meltdown. And Harold, poor Harold, billing her at his Sunday emergency rate for the privilege of delivering more bad news, would have to explain that she'd essentially nominated herself for permanent exclusion. But we're engaged, she'd insist, waving her ring around as though jewelry had legal standing. You were engaged, Harold would correct, because lawyers treat verb tenses like sacred objects. And according to this clause, your conduct at Friday's dinner constitutes adversarial legal action conducted in bad faith. Which means what? Rachel would demand. Which means you're out. Permanently. There is no appeal window, no negotiation mechanism, no workaround. The clause is self-executing and irrevocable. Harold would probably pause here, leafing through pages, hunting for anything useful. Miss Abernathy, I have to ask, were you aware he had this clause in his estate declaration? Of course not. How would I possibly know that? Because it was filed on Friday morning, prior to your dinner, which means he anticipated your plans and protected himself before you acted. Harold would sound genuinely impressed despite himself, because even attorneys have to tip their hat to superior legal strategy. This is actually quite sophisticated estate planning. I could picture Rachel working through several shades of red as the timeline fully landed. I'd filed this Friday morning. The prenup ambush happened Friday evening. Which meant I'd already read her move and made my countermove before she'd even played her hand. I'd watched her push her chips in, and I'd simply removed myself from the table entirely. My phone buzzed. Right on schedule. It was a text from Grace. Did you actually list me as primary trustee on your estate? I texted back, yes. You have excellent judgment and you told Rachel her shoes were trying too hard. Fair point. Does this mean I have actual responsibilities now? Only if I die. Please try not to let that happen. Deal. By the way, Malcolm called me laughing. What exactly did you do? Protected my assets from predatory relationship practices. Most Marcus answer in history. I'm proud of you. Also, Rachel has been calling me. Don't pick up. Wasn't planning to. Her shoes genuinely were trying too hard. I adore my sister. She has the kind of unfiltered honesty that makes family dinners memorable and major life decisions crystal clear. When I first introduced her to Rachel at some charity event last year, Grace took one look at her and whispered, "She's calculating your net worth right now." I can see it in the way her eyes move. I'd laughed it off at the time. But Grace had been right. Grace is always right, which is alternately irritating and deeply reassuring. My phone buzzed again. Malcolm, Rachel's lawyer just called me asking if the exclusion clause is negotiable. What did you tell him? I told him that irrevocable means irrevocable, and if he doesn't understand what irrevocable means, he might want to reconsider his career path. Then I hung up. Too much? Perfect. Good. Want to grab lunch? I feel like celebrating. Celebrating what specifically? The fact that you just drafted the most beautiful piece of preemptive legal architecture I've ever witnessed. And you built it before the offense even took place. That's not revenge, that's prophecy. I smiled, looking down at the estate declaration spread across my kitchen table. He wasn't wrong. This wasn't revenge. Revenge is reactive, messy, emotional. This was just preparation. This was me paying attention when someone showed me who they were, and responding accordingly. Rachel had revealed herself the moment she proposed a joint vineyard account where she contributed less than half but expected equal authority. She'd revealed herself again when she began talking about protecting our individual interests while only meaning her own. And she'd made it unmistakable when she planned a prenup ambush with spectators and legal counsel instead of sitting down for an honest conversation like two adults. I'd just been listening. And unlike Rachel, I'd actually read every word of everything I'd ever signed, including the fine print I'd written myself. The morning sun was streaming through my kitchen window, falling across the estate declaration like a spotlight on a stage. Every page was clean. Every clause was airtight. Every decision was entirely mine. My estate. My rules. My peace of mind. I gathered all the papers, slipped them back into the envelope, and locked them in my safe. Then I texted Malcolm back, "Lunch sounds great. Pick somewhere good. I'm celebrating financial independence." "You're always celebrating something." "That's because I keep winning." And the beautiful thing was, I wasn't bragging. I was simply reporting facts. Rachel had tried to play chess, but she'd forgotten to check whether I even wanted to be at the board. So I'd picked up my pieces, redesigned the game from scratch, and left her sitting there wondering how it had all slipped away. That's how you protect yourself from relationships that were never built on solid ground. Not with anger. Not with spectacle. With paperwork, clear thinking, and a really good lawyer who has excellent taste in scotch. Malcolm and I had lunch at this Italian place downtown that makes pasta so good it probably ought to be regulated. We sat outside on the patio in that perfect kind of afternoon that makes all your problems feel impossibly distant, except I no longer had any problems, because I'd methodically dismantled them one legal document at a time. We were somewhere into our second bottle of wine, a considerably better vintage than my $8 Trader Joe's special, when Malcolm's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then started laughing hard enough to almost lose his grip on a forkful of fettuccine. "What?" I asked, twirling my own pasta like a civilized adult, despite strong internal pressure to just shovel it in. "Oh man," Malcolm wheezed, dabbing his eyes. "You remember how Rachel called me yesterday?" "Vaguely. I was busy reorganizing my garage and enjoying my life." "Well, she apparently didn't stop there. She forwarded the estate documents to her old law professor." He turned his phone toward me, showing an email chain. "Dr. Elias Monroe. The man's a genuine legend. 30 years at Yale. Wrote half the textbooks on estate law. Literally invented several of the trust structures we use today." I leaned in, now fully interested. "She sent my estate declaration to Elias Monroe." "She did." And he just responded. Malcolm was grinning like it was Christmas morning. "You want to read it, or should I perform it dramatically?" "Dramatically. Use your full lawyer voice." Malcolm cleared his throat, straightened up, and adopted the measured gravitas of someone delivering a verdict. "Dear Rachel," he began. "I have reviewed the estate declaration you forwarded to me, along with your account of the circumstances surrounding your recent engagement complications." "Engagement complications," I repeated. Elegant way to describe I laid a trap for my fiancée and it blew up in my face. "Quiet, I'm not done," Malcolm said, raising a hand. "After careful review of the documents and the timeline you provided, I find myself with one essential question. Why did you attempt to corner a man with a prenuptial agreement when he quite literally helped write portions of the tax code you're attempting to cite?" I nearly sprayed wine across the table. "He did not say that." "He absolutely did," Malcolm confirmed, scrolling on. "But it gets even better. Mr. Whitman's estate structure is not merely legally sound, it is frankly a masterclass in preemptive asset protection. The self-executing exclusion clause is particularly elegant. I've seen comparable mechanisms deployed in corporate law, but rarely applied to personal estates with this degree of precision. The federal sovereign shelter status is creative, thorough, and nearly impossible to challenge without expenditures that would far exceed any conceivable recovery. "I genuinely like this man," I said, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. "Furthermore," Malcolm continued, visibly relishing every word, "the timing of the filing, executed prior to your prenuptial presentation, demonstrates that Mr. Whitman anticipated your approach and responded not with emotion, but with strategy. This is not the behavior of someone acting impulsively or out of spite. This is the behavior of someone who understands legal protection and exercises it with discipline." "Discipline," I echoed. "I should frame that." "He's still not done destroying her," Malcolm said, scrolling further. "Rachel, I speak to you now not as a legal consultant, but as someone who has known you since you enrolled in my estate planning 301 course. You have always been sharp, driven, and capable. However, you have also consistently underestimated people you perceived as less socially positioned than yourself. Mr. Whitman may not come from generational wealth, but he is demonstrably a sophisticated legal thinker with resources and knowledge that rival, if not surpass, many of the attorneys you have relied upon. I raised my glass in quiet tribute to not coming from old money and still outthinking everyone in the room. Malcolm clinked his glass against mine. To that. But here comes the closing argument. My professional recommendation is to cease all legal action immediately. The estate architecture is impenetrable. The exclusion clause was triggered by your own conduct, and any attempt to contest it will generate substantial legal costs with virtually no realistic chance of success. My personal counsel is to ask yourself why you felt the need to shield yourself from someone you claim to love, and why you chose to do so through public spectacle rather than honest conversation. Regards, Dr. Elias Monroe. We sat with that for a moment. The weight of that final paragraph landing on the table between us like something perfectly cooked, precise and quietly devastating. He just academically leveled her, I said eventually. That wasn't legal advice at the end. That was a professor telling his former student she'd failed both the assignment and the course. The man is a legend for a reason, Malcolm said, setting down his phone and returning to his pasta. Met him once at a conference. Sharp as a scalpel, no patience whatsoever for nonsense, and apparently zero tolerance for weaponized prenups. Did she write back? I asked, curiosity winning. Malcolm checked his phone. Oh, absolutely. She sent 3 paragraphs defending herself, justifying the prenup, explaining she was just being prudent, all the usual. He scrolled. He replied with 4 words. You were being cruel. I needed a moment with those 4 words. Not a legal argument, not a dissertation, not a paragraph of nuanced context, just 4 words that cut straight through everything to the truth of it. You were being cruel. Because that's what it was. Not careful, not strategic, not self-protective, cruel. Taking someone you claim to love and humiliating them in front of an audience because you valued your assets more than their dignity. I need to send this man something, I said. He doesn't accept gifts from parties involved in active legal situations, Malcolm said. Already looked it up. But I forwarded him a thank you on your behalf, and he replied that watching competent estate planning executed in real time was thanks enough. Professional solidarity, I said approvingly. Respect. We finished lunch in the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd known each other long enough that not every moment needs filling. Malcolm had been my friend since college, back when we were both broke and arguing about policy reform over instant noodles like it actually mattered. Now we were grown men eating good pasta and celebrating the fact that legal knowledge outlasts inherited privilege every single time. After lunch, Malcolm headed back to deal with a client situation, something about a trust fund that needed urgent attention, and only he could fix it. I went home feeling lighter than I had in months. Dr. Monroe's words hadn't been necessary, but they'd landed like a gift. Having a legendary law professor reduce the whole thing to 4 syllables, you were being cruel, was the universe handing you a gold star you hadn't asked for. I got home around 4, changed into comfortable clothes, and made a deliberate decision to accomplish absolutely nothing for the rest of the evening. I'd earned it. I'd spent an entire weekend fending off legal attacks, restructuring my financial life, and apparently impressing law school professors I'd never met. If that didn't justify a lazy Sunday evening, nothing on earth did. I was settling onto my couch with a thriller I'd been meaning to start for months, corporate espionage story that now felt almost quaint next to my actual life, when my phone rang from an unknown number. Something told me to pick it up. Marcus Whitman. Mr. Whitman, this is Bethany Chun. We met at Rachel's dinner Friday evening. Her voice was careful, strained, the way someone sounds when they're picking their footing through a conversation they're not sure how to have. Bethany, private equity Bethany, one of Rachel's friends who'd applauded the prenup like it was a graduation ceremony. I remember, I said, neutral. I want to apologize, she said, quickly, like she'd been rehearsing it. For Friday night, for clapping, for being part of that whole setup. Rachel told us it was going to be a celebration, and when the prenup came out, I just went along with it. That was wrong. That was genuinely wrong. Go on, I said, sitting up a little straighter. I've been in finance for 10 years, Bethany continued. I understand asset protection. And what Rachel did Friday wasn't asset protection, it was a power play. She positioned you to fail in front of witnesses. And I was part of that audience. I'm sorry. Apology accepted, I said, because it was. She'd been a pawn in Rachel's game, not the one dealing the cards. Thank you, she said, and the relief in her voice was audible. And for what it's worth, the way you handled it, just standing up and leaving like that was the most composed thing I've watched anyone do in years. Half the people at that table are still talking about it. Rachel is losing friends over this. That's a shame, I said, and I actually meant it. I didn't want Rachel's whole social world to crumble. I just wanted her to understand that choices carry weight. It's earned, Bethany said bluntly. She's been calling people, trying to rally support, asking everyone to validate her side of it. But Marcus, I've seen the estate documents. My firm deals in trust law. What you built isn't retaliation. It's protection. And honestly, it's impressive as hell. We talked a few more minutes, Bethany asking some professional questions about the federal shelter structure. Apparently her firm was looking at similar setups for certain clients, and me sharing general information without getting into specifics. By the time we hung up, I had a feeling Bethany was going to be just fine. She'd learned something valuable about choosing your audience carefully and not applauding someone else's cruelty. As the evening wound down, I made dinner, nothing complicated, just chicken and roasted vegetables, because adulthood occasionally requires eating something that isn't noodles, and turned over the strange arc of the weekend in my mind. Friday night, I'd walked out of a restaurant feeling blindsided and betrayed. By Sunday evening, I had a law professor complimenting my estate planning, my ex-fiancé's friends calling to apologize, and a sense of inner calm that truly cannot be purchased at any price. The thing about revenge, and I say this as someone who apparently just executed a masterclass in it without entirely intending to, is that the best kind isn't theatrical. It's not about making scenes or torching bridges or getting even in some dramatic, public fashion. The best revenge is just living well, protecting yourself with intelligence, and letting other people's poor decisions speak for themselves. Rachel had tried to pin me down with a prenup, and she'd pinned herself instead with an exclusion clause. Harold had tried to freeze my assets and frozen his own confidence instead. And Dr. Monroe, a man I'd never crossed paths with, had summed it all up with more precision than I ever could have managed. You were being cruel. I finished my dinner, washed up, and poured one last glass of wine. Not the $8 stuff and not the restaurant splurge, something right in the middle. Good enough to genuinely enjoy, affordable enough not to wince if I spilled it. Then I went out to my porch and watched the last of the daylight fade, feeling grateful for legal knowledge, loyal people, and the kind of clarity that only arrives after you walk away from someone who was never really on your side. Monday was coming. The rest of the world would return to work. Rachel would probably try a new angle. Harold would continue his quiet reckoning with federal trust law. But tonight, I was just a man with good food in his stomach, decent wine in his glass, and the best legal protection money could buy. Monday morning arrived and I woke up dangerously energized, which is never entirely a good sign. It usually means I'm about to do something that seems reasonable in the moment and haunts me just a little later. I made coffee, checked my emails, and found myself staring at an invitation I'd received 2 weeks prior and completely forgotten about. It was from Wealth and Estate Quarterly, one of those professional publications that financial advisors and estate attorneys read to feel current and occasionally to actually learn something. They'd asked me to submit a short piece for their Expert Perspectives column, a thought, an insight, something about estate planning. Nothing heavy. Maximum 100 words. I'd been ignoring it because I'd been busy planning a wedding that was never going to happen. But now I had free time, strong opinions, and a weekend's worth of lived experience that had given me some very specific thoughts about trust, relationships, and the value of legal protection. So I opened my laptop, pulled up the email, and stared at the blank response field. 100 words. What could I say in 100 words that would be useful, professional, and not obviously pulled directly from my own weekend wreckage? I thought about Rachel, the prenup, the vineyard account she could no longer access. I thought about Harold and his failed injunction, about Dr. Monroe's 4 words, about the exclusion clause Rachel had triggered herself. And then I thought about wine, because lately, everything in my life seemed to orbit back to wine or vineyards or bottles that cost more than they had any right to. My fingers started typing before my brain had fully approved the plan. Trust is like wine. Give it time or it turns to vinegar. Fortunately, trust is revocable. I read it back. 20 words, well inside the limit. Clean, professional, and directly applicable to real estate planning, since revocable trusts were a legitimate, widely used structure. But also sharp, beautifully precise, aimed at my situation in a way that only people who knew the whole story would fully recognize. It was perfect. Professional enough to publish and pointed enough to satisfy something deep in my soul. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. The editor replied within the hour, "Love this. Running it in tomorrow's digital edition. Thank you, Marcus." And that was that. I went about my Monday, real work, real clients, real phone calls, some light reorganizing because I was apparently still in a tidying phase, and didn't give the quote another thought until Tuesday morning. Tuesday morning, my phone started buzzing at 7:23, which is far too early for anyone to have strong feelings about anything. I ignored it for 4 minutes before curiosity got me and I checked to see what had happened while I was asleep. Turns out disaster was the wrong word. Phenomenon was closer. My quote had appeared in the digital edition of Wealth and Estate Quarterly, which typically received a solid but measured readership from the professional finance world, except this time, someone had screenshotted it and posted it online, and it had taken on an entire life of its own. The caption read, "Estate attorney drops the most elegant divorce-coded advice ever," with the screenshot of my quote attached. 47,000 likes and climbing. The replies were something else entirely. "This is about someone specific and I absolutely need to know who. My divorce attorney quoted this in our meeting this morning. Iconic. Trust is revocable. I'm getting this tattooed, from someone who definitely shouldn't be making permanent decisions based on online content." But the genuinely fascinating part was the legal community's response. Attorneys were reposting it. Estate lawyers were sharing it with commentary. Someone had created the hashtag #TrustRevocable. Within hours, it had made its way to LinkedIn, where finance professionals were putting it up with captions like "Words to build by and this is exactly why we do what we do." By lunchtime, it had reached the place all viral moments eventually arrive, legal corners of the internet. And those communities did what they do best, they investigated. Wait, isn't Marcus Whitman the guy whose fiancée blindsided him with a prenup last weekend? Someone posted. Oh my God, it is. A contact at the county clerk's office told me about this whole thing. Apparently the guy restructured his entire estate before the prenup dinner even went down. The federal sovereign shelter guy, that was actually him. No wonder she can't access his money. He wrote this line after locking her out of everything. This isn't professional advice. This is a victory lap. I was sitting at my kitchen table watching my phone light up like a pinball machine, and I started laughing. Not the measured, private kind from the other night, this was full, uncontrolled laughter that might have concerned the neighbors. I hadn't planned for this. I genuinely hadn't. I just wanted to contribute one useful line to a professional journal while landing a quiet dig at my ex-fiancée. Instead, I'd accidentally become the internet's favorite bitter estate attorney, and legal Twitter had elevated me to some kind of folk hero status. My phone rang. Malcolm, already laughing before I'd finished saying hello. "Dude," he said. "You just broke legal Twitter." I wasn't trying to, I protested, watching the notifications stack up in real time. "One sentence," Malcolm said. "You wrote one sentence about wine and trust and now every attorney in 3 states is talking about Rachel without anyone saying her name. This is art. People are apparently planning tattoos." "Marcus, I know. I saw. Someone tagged me asking if I was your lawyer, and I said yes. I now have 200 new followers. You've made me internet famous by association." I kept scrolling through responses. Someone had paired my quote with a side-by-side breakdown of different revocable trust structures. A law firm in Boston had put it up in their break room. A family law attorney had printed it out and taped it to her filing cabinet. And then I found the ones about Rachel. Rachel Abernathy was circulating. Not officially trending, but enough that people were drawing connections. A charity event she'd been organizing for months had been quietly cancelled. 2 speaking invitations had been removed from event websites. Friends were distancing themselves on social media in numbers significant enough that people were noticing and writing about it. I felt something that might have been a flicker of guilt. But it passed pretty quickly. I hadn't named anyone. I hadn't told the story publicly. I'd written one sentence about wine, and the internet had done the rest. If Rachel was facing social consequences, it was because people who knew her had connected the dots themselves. Grace texted, "You're trending online. Mom wants to know if this is good or bad." I replied, "Good. I think I wrote something about wine and now I'm apparently famous for being quietly petty. That's completely on brand. Mom says congratulations. Dad wants to know if you're still coming for dinner Sunday. Wouldn't miss it." My phone buzzed with an incoming call from a New York area code I didn't recognize. I answered carefully. "Mr. Whitman, this is Jennifer Park from the Wall Street Journal. I'm working on a piece about social media and professional advice, and I'd love your perspective on your viral quote." The Wall Street Journal. The actual Wall Street Journal wanted to discuss a piece of quiet revenge I dashed off in 30 seconds over morning coffee. "I appreciate the call," I said, years of professional instinct kicking in despite the surreal nature of the situation. "But I think the quote holds up on its own. Trust is central to estate planning, and like wine, it demands care and patience." "What inspired it?" she pressed. "Personal experience and professional observation," I said, which was completely true and entirely unhelpful. The best guidance usually comes from living through something. We went back and forth a few more minutes, me giving carefully diplomatic non-answers, her gently probing for confirmation it was about Rachel. I neither confirmed nor denied, which probably made the whole story more compelling than if I'd just told her everything outright. After hanging up, Malcolm called again. "Was that the Wall Street Journal? How did you?" They rang me too, asking about federal sovereign shelter status and whether it connected to your quote. I told them I don't comment on client matters, but that your estate planning was exemplary. They're probably writing this story regardless of whether we cooperate. Great, I said, though genuinely, I was a little thrilled. So my breakup is going to appear in the Wall Street Journal. Your quote is going to appear in the Wall Street Journal, Malcolm clarified. Your breakup is just the subtext. There's a meaningful difference. By that evening, the quote had appeared in 3 financial newsletters, 2 legal blogs, and an Instagram account dedicated to corporate wisdom that had 800,000 followers. Someone had turned it into a motivational poster with sunset imagery and wine glasses. A law school professor had used it to open a lecture on revocable trusts. And through all of it, Rachel had gone completely dark on social media. No posts, no comments, no activity, just silence, which in the modern era is basically a white flag. I made dinner, leftover pasta from the weekend, because I believe in using what I have, and scrolled through the conversation I'd accidentally ignited. Think pieces about trust in relationships. Debates about how to do a prenup right. 17,000 people who had apparently never considered that trust was revocable and now felt very strongly about it. My favorite response came from a divorce attorney in Chicago who'd written, 20 years in family law. This quote is going on my business cards. Thank you, Marcus Whitman, for compressing my entire career into one line. I raised my glass of leftover wine, because of course I was drinking wine while reading about my wine quote going viral, and toasted to nothing in particular. The real satisfaction wasn't the attention or the notifications or even the quiet implosion of Rachel's social calendar. The real satisfaction was that I'd said something honest and useful and people had recognized it as both. Yes, it was pointed. Yes, it came directly from my situation. But it was also genuinely sound thinking about estate planning and the role of trust in protecting yourself. Trust is like wine. Give it time or it turns to vinegar. Fortunately, trust is revocable. 20 words written in 30 seconds had become the most widely shared thing I'd ever put out into the world. And I hadn't even been aiming for that. I'd just been honest about what a very strange weekend had taught me. My phone buzzed one more time. Unknown number. A text, "This is Dr. Elias Monroe. Your quote was elegant. Well done." I stared at it for a long moment, then saved the number and replied, "Thank you, sir. Your 4 words were pretty elegant too." He sent back a single thumbs up emoji, which from a legendary law professor was basically a standing ovation. I finished my wine, switched off notifications, they'd reached a genuinely unmanageable volume, and went to bed feeling like I'd stumbled into winning something I hadn't even known was a competition. Tomorrow, the internet would move on to something else. Rachel would probably start rebuilding. Harold would continue his slow reckoning with federal trust law. But tonight, I was the person who'd turned a broken engagement into a viral moment with one line about wine. And honestly, that felt pretty extraordinary. A week later, I sent Rachel the final document by certified mail, signature required, because certain things deserve a little ceremony. Inside was the formal announcement that all my significant holdings, real estate, investments, the antique collection I'd spent years building, had been moved into a charitable foundation. The Whitman Foundation for Educational Advancement, specifically. Scholarships for students who genuinely needed them, not trust fund recipients playing at generosity. But here's the elegant part. Buried in Section 4, Paragraph 3, Subsection B was a single clause that Malcolm had called the pièce de résistance. Any individual who initiates adversarial claims, including prenuptial negotiations conducted in bad faith or public coercion, shall be permanently barred from foundation benefits, advisory positions, or acknowledgement. Rachel had triggered it herself the moment she staged that dinner. She'd automatically closed every door. My foundation attorney, a brilliant woman named Diane who specialized in nonprofit law, called it self-executing poetic justice. I called it a Tuesday. Now, if Rachel ever wanted to be anywhere near my money, she'd have to make a charitable donation first. And even then, the only thing she'd be funding was scholarships for kids who weren't her. I slept incredibly well that night. Rachel made one last attempt. She called Harold, who by that point sounded like a man whose spirit had quietly packed its things and taken an extended holiday somewhere far from estate law. "Harold," she probably said, voice tight with desperation. "There has to be a way through this." Poor Harold. I almost felt something for him. Almost. "Ma'am," he said, and Malcolm told me later that Harold had started calling her ma'am instead of Miss Abernathy, which is attorney speak for I have emotionally checked out of this situation. She can't even get your name into a court document anymore. The foundation structure, the federal shelter, the exclusion clauses, it's all sealed. There has to be a loophole. There isn't. Mr. Whitman's holdings are now structured inside a living trust so layered it could survive an alien invasion. Even with the most aggressive legal team imaginable, they'd need clearance from his accountant just to get started. I do love that Malcolm had been copied on that exchange. Harold had sent it as a professional courtesy, which really translated to, "Please confirm I haven't lost my mind entirely." The funny thing was, I wasn't even angry anymore. I was entertained. Most love stories end in heartbreak. Mine ended in an IRS-approved fortress. A week later, Rachel showed up at my gate in the rain. No makeup. No entourage. No lawyer in a tuxedo. Just her, soaked through, looking like regret given human form. She stood there shivering and asked the one question I'd been expecting. "You knew I was going to ask for the prenup, didn't you?" I looked at her through the gate. This woman I'd nearly married. Someone who'd chosen control over connection at every possible turn. "I hoped you wouldn't." I slid an envelope through the bars. Inside was a letter I'd written a full year before we'd even met, back when I was just a man trying to protect himself from mistakes he could see coming from a distance. "If love ever becomes leverage, lock the vault. Marcus Whitman." She read it. The tears came, not the pretty kind from films, but the honest, ugly kind that surfaces when you realize you've dismantled something irreplaceable through your own choices. I didn't gloat. Didn't lecture. Didn't offer the satisfaction of "I told you so." I just turned around and walked back inside to make a cup of coffee. Because real consequences don't need noise or drama or flames. They just need time. And calm, my friend, is what undoes them completely. Story 2. My wife left our gallery opening with her hand on another man's back. When she told me to know my place in front of 50 strangers, I set down my champagne, walked out, and never looked back. A year later she showed up at my door begging for help. There's a specific kind of quiet that takes over a room the second your wife tears you apart in front of 50 people you've never met. And I can tell you exactly what it sounds like, because I've lived it. It sounds like that frozen moment right after a grenade pin gets yanked. That one heartbeat where everything stops. Where the whole world seems to suck in a breath and just wait for the blast that's already on its way, the one that nobody can do a thing to stop. I was standing right in the middle of the Hartwell Gallery in downtown Atlanta, surrounded by people who probably dropped more on a single pair of shoes than I cleared in an entire month. I was holding a glass of champagne that cost more than my first car. And I was watching my wife, Miranda, laughing at something another man had just breathed into her ear, his hand sitting on the small of her back like he'd already signed the deed on every part of her. The gallery reeked of expensive perfume, pretension, and the specific brand of desperation that only truly insecure people produce when they're working overtime to convince everyone around them that they've earned their spot in the room. My name is Daniel Wright. 38 years old. By that point in my life, I had already made it through 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan, a helicopter crash that had no business leaving me breathing, 17 separate shrapnel wounds that had mapped themselves across my torso like a battle record, and the particular kind of loneliness that burrows into your bones when you finally accept that the woman you married sees you as nothing more than a convenient stand-in she's been holding on to until something worth keeping comes along. I'd earned a Bronze Star for dragging 3 wounded Marines out of a vehicle that was actively on fire while enemy rounds were still coming in. I'd been promoted twice for leading under conditions that would have snapped most men. Every soldier I'd ever served alongside had respected me, not because I demanded it, but because I showed up, did the work, and never asked anyone to take on something I wasn't willing to handle myself. That evening I had on my best suit, a navy blue one Miranda had approved with a half-hearted nod about 3 years before. I'd made sure every crease was sharp and every button was clean. Still, standing in that gallery, I felt like a fraud. The art on the walls was abstract nonsense, the kind of thing that looks like a toddler got loose with a full paint set, and yet everyone around me was nodding at it with this deep, serious expression, like they were receiving some kind of divine transmission from a gray canvas with a single red dot in the corner. I kept wondering how many of them actually saw something in it, and how many were just too scared to be the first one to admit they had no clue what they were looking at. Miranda was holding court near that ugly piece, Emergence of the Corporate Soul, the plaque said, surrounded by her colleagues from the investment firm. Every one of them looked like they'd been assembled directly from a catalog for people with more money than sense. The man with his hand on her back was Vince Caldwell, 40 years old, wearing Italian wool, moving through rooms like a predator who'd already decided what he wanted. He'd been orbiting Miranda for months. Always at the right events. Always with the right thing to say. Always looking at her like she was a position he was positioning himself to acquire. I'd watched their routine play out for weeks, convincing myself Miranda was just being polite. Networking. Doing what she had to do to survive in a cutthroat industry. But something about the way she leaned into his touch that night landed in my gut with a certainty I'd been working hard not to face. The people circling them were familiar from other events Miranda had pulled me to. Harrison Blake, hedge fund guy, just lost his trophy wife to her personal trainer. Patricia Wentworth, corporate attorney with a reputation for ruthlessness that bled straight from her work life into her personal one. And Tyler Morrison, a venture capitalist who'd built his fortune by funding companies that made people's lives marginally worse in exchange for marginal convenience. These were Miranda's people now. The tribe she'd chosen. And watching them cluster together made it unmistakably clear just how far apart she and I had drifted across 7 years of marriage. I walked over because that's what a husband does. Because I'd sat in 45 minutes of traffic to get to an event Miranda had told me was critical for her career. Because somewhere, buried deep, I still believed that the woman I had actually married, 7 years ago, was still somewhere inside the polished, cold stranger who looked at me lately like I was an inconvenience she hadn't quite figured out how to eliminate. My hands were rough from years of heavy machinery work at the port. I noticed, as I moved through the crowd, how soft and manicured everyone else's were, and I felt their eyes pass over me with that particular cocktail of mild curiosity and dismissal that wealthy people save for those they've already ranked below themselves. The floor was polished marble, throwing the chandelier light right back at you. My dress shoes, worn, not new, squeaked with every step. Like an announcement nobody had asked for. "Miranda," I said, keeping my voice level even as my chest tightened. "I was thinking we could head out soon. Maybe grab some food on the way, that Thai place over on Peachtree you used to love." The conversation around her died instantly, like someone had cut the power. I watched Miranda's expression shift from bright and animated to something cold and precise, the look of someone who's just decided to make a point. Vince's hand didn't budge from her back. He looked at me with a smile that had absolutely no warmth in it, all teeth, like a wolf that had already sized up the rabbit and was just taking its time. The people around them suddenly found their champagne glasses fascinating, eyes darting back and forth between us like they could feel the impact coming. "Daniel," she said, and the way she said my name made it sound like a diagnosis she was relaying to a specialist. "I'm in the middle of something. Can you just go wait somewhere until I'm ready?" "We've been here 3 hours, I said, trying to sound reasonable even as the heat behind my eyes started building. "You haven't said a word to me since we walked in. I'm just saying maybe we could spend a little time together. That's all." What came next is the part that's burned into me, the kind of memory that replays with the brutal clarity that only real trauma seems to produce. Miranda turned to face me completely. And I watched her mouth pull into a smile that had nothing to do with being happy and everything to do with intent. The kind of smile a cat has right before the pounce. The string quartet in the corner seemed to go silent, or maybe they didn't. I couldn't hear anything anymore except the blood moving through my ears and the slow, steady thud of my own heartbeat. "You want to know what the problem is, Daniel?" she said, her voice pitched just loud enough that everyone nearby could catch every single word. "The problem is that you trail around after me like a dog that's been lost too long, begging for crumbs of my time like you're some kind of charity case I'm obligated to maintain. Do you have any idea what it feels like to have you following me through these rooms? Standing there in your cheap suit with your rough hands, making it look like I settled for less than I was worth?" Someone behind me actually gasped. I heard a muffled "oh my god" from somewhere in the crowd. The string quartet may or may not have kept playing, I honestly couldn't tell anymore. All I could register was the sound of blood in my ears and the beat of my own heart, which was, surprisingly, steady. I noticed Vince had his phone out, angled in a way that suggested documentation, probably thinking about the story he'd tell later. The time his girlfriend's husband imploded at a gallery opening. The words hit me like direct hits, each one landing precisely in the places she knew were unguarded, the insecurities I'd handed her during quiet nights when I actually believed we were building something real together. She knew about the nightmares that still yank me awake at 3 a.m. She knew about the survivor's guilt, the question of why I came home when so many of my brothers didn't. She knew about the imposter syndrome that followed me into every cocktail party and corporate event she dragged me to. She had held all of that. And now she was using it as ammunition, deploying it in front of an audience of strangers who would be dining out on this story for years. Vince was still wearing that predator's grin. Drinking it all in like it was the finest thing being served that evening. "Miranda, please," I started. She wasn't even close to done. "Going forward," she announced, and I mean announced, voice carrying across the gallery like a verdict being read aloud, "I will decide when we spend time together or have any kind of conversation. Do you understand me? Stop chasing me around like you're desperate. Stop calling 15 times a day to ask about my schedule. Stop appearing at my office with lunch like we're starring in some kind of romantic comedy. Know your place, Daniel. Know your place." What followed was a silence so complete it had weight. The kind of silence where you can hear your own blood moving and traffic sounds bleeding in from the street outside. Everyone in our section of the gallery was watching me, waiting. Waiting for the eruption. Waiting for the thing that a man with my background was obviously going to do. Waiting for the scene that would give them something to talk about. Vince actually laughed. Soft, low, but it landed like a slap. And I watched him pull Miranda against him in a proprietary squeeze that was staged entirely for my benefit. Here's what people don't always understand about being a Marine. Yes, they train you to respond to threats with controlled, decisive force. To meet aggression head on. To neutralize whatever's putting your people at risk. But they also build something else into you, a discipline so deep it becomes structural. The kind of self-control that lets you sit completely still while rounds are snapping past your head. That makes you wait for the right moment rather than wasting everything on panic. All of that kicked in as I stood there, absorbing what Miranda had just done. I felt my breathing slow. My heart rate dropped. My body was ready, but not for what they thought was coming. I wasn't going to hand these people their show. Wasn't going to confirm every assumption they had about men like me, working class, rough-handed, emotionally volatile. Wasn't going to give Miranda the weapon she needed to reframe herself as the victim. Instead, something inside me shifted. A deep, structural realignment. The love I'd been white-knuckling onto, the hope that we could somehow get back to whatever we'd been at the start, it didn't break. It just evaporated. Like mist when the sun finally comes out and burns it away completely. I set my champagne glass on the nearest surface. Gently. Carefully. The gentleness seemed to catch people off guard. I squared my shoulders the way my drill instructor had drilled into me at Paris Island. And when I spoke, my voice was exactly what it needed to be, calm, clear, and final. The voice of a man who has already made his decision and is now simply carrying it out. You're right, Miranda, I said, looking directly at her. I have been chasing you. Holding on to something that clearly isn't there anymore. But here's the thing about chasing, eventually, a man has to stop and ask himself whether whatever he's running after is actually worth catching. And I just answered that question. I pivoted on my heel with parade ground precision and walked toward the exit. Back straight. Head up. The crowd moved aside. I could already hear the whispers spinning up behind me, the gossip engine firing to life, ready to spread this across every social circle in Atlanta by morning. Miranda called something after me, her voice carrying a note I hadn't heard in it for a long time, something uncertain. I didn't turn around. Didn't give her a single look back. The night air outside hit me like a release. Clean and cool after all that suffocating perfume and performance. My truck was parked 3 blocks away. The valet had looked at my 10-year-old Ford F-150 like it might somehow contaminate the Maseratis lined up out front. I walked those 3 blocks in a state that was somewhere between shock and something that felt, oddly, like freedom. By the time I got into that worn leather seat and shut the door, my mind was already moving. Clicking through next steps with the tactical clarity that had kept me alive through more firefights than I cared to count. The drive back to the Buckhead house took 40 minutes in light traffic. I used every one of those minutes to think. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, a 3-story statement of Miranda's ambitions that we had no business being able to afford, but that she had declared non-negotiable for the image she needed to project. I had worked double shifts at the port for 2 straight years to cover the down payment. Gave up vacations, hobbies, anything resembling personal fulfillment, to make sure Miranda had everything she said she needed. And what had it bought me? A public execution in front of strangers, and a wife who had apparently long since started seeing me as a liability to be managed rather than a person to be loved. I didn't sleep that night. But it wasn't the restless, anxious kind of sleeplessness. I moved through the house with purpose, pulling documents, making lists, preparing for what I knew was coming. The Marine Corps had etched it into me, proper preparation prevents poor performance. I was going to execute this withdrawal the same way I'd executed every mission, with precision and zero wasted motion. By 3 in the morning I had located the marriage certificate, the prenuptial agreement Miranda had insisted on and that I had, fortunately, read with actual care before signing, 5 years of financial records, and documentation covering every major purchase we'd made together. The house was quiet in the way that places get quiet when 2 people have stopped really sharing a life and are just occupying the same square footage. I moved through rooms Miranda had decorated without once asking what I thought, past furniture she'd picked because it photographed well for her social media, under light fixtures that had cost more than my first vehicle. Every single object in that house was a small reminder of how thoroughly my preferences had been treated as irrelevant. How completely I had allowed myself to disappear in the name of keeping the peace. In the kitchen, I brewed a pot of strong coffee and sat at the Italian marble island that Miranda had imported at a cost that still made me flinch to think about. The stone was cold against my palms. I thought about all the times I'd sat in this exact spot, waiting for her to get home, telling myself that tonight might be different. That tonight she might look at me the way she had during our courtship, before she'd decided I was a project that needed upgrading rather than a partner who deserved to be seen. By 5 in the morning, I'd packed 2 duffel bags with everything that actually mattered to me, which turned out to be far less than I expected. Some clothes. My military decorations and discharge papers. My father's toolbox, or at least the toolbox belonging to the man I had always believed was my father. And a handful of photographs from before Miranda had decided that my Marine Corps background was something to conceal from her sophisticated crowd rather than something to stand behind. I held one of those photos for a while. Me in full dress uniform on the day I received the Bronze Star. My face younger. My eyes still holding something bright that had gradually faded across years of trying to be someone I wasn't built to be. I tucked it in carefully. I left behind the expensive watch from our 5th anniversary. The designer clothes she'd insisted I buy. Every artifact of the 7-year performance I'd been putting on. None of it had ever really been mine. It was a wardrobe for a character in Miranda's story. And now that the story was over, I had no use for any of it. The wedding ring came off last. I set it on the glass coffee table with a sound that seemed to carry through the empty house like a gunshot. Next to it, I placed the divorce papers I'd downloaded and completed during the night, already signed everywhere that needed my signature. I didn't write a long letter. Didn't pour out my feelings in some final bid to be understood. Just one sticky note on the bathroom mirror, right where she'd see it when she came home. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine. Don't look for me. The sun was just beginning to come up over the Atlanta skyline when I walked out of that house for the last time. And I remember thinking that there's a particular kind of beauty to a sunrise after a night with no sleep, like the universe offering you something for making it all the way through the dark. My truck fired up on the first try despite its age, and I pointed it south toward Savannah, where I'd been running a small workshop for the past few years. A place where I repaired heavy equipment for the Port Authority and got to breathe when Miranda decided she needed relief from what she called my oppressive presence. The drive usually ran about 4 hours, but I stopped twice. Once for coffee. Once to just sit by the road and let the reality of what I was doing move through me in layers, grief, anger, and underneath all of it, something that felt genuinely close to relief. 7 years. 7 years of trying to be enough for a woman who had never really wanted me, who had chosen me because I was solid and reliable and conveniently available at the moment she decided she needed a husband to round out her career image. Who had methodically chipped away at everything that made me who I was until I barely recognized the person I saw in mirrors anymore. When I finally pulled up to my Savannah workshop on the edge of the city's industrial port district, the building looked better than it had any right to. A converted warehouse I'd picked up for almost nothing 5 years earlier and slowly turned into something that worked. The smell hit me the moment I opened the door, grease and metal and a faint salt tang from the ocean nearby. The honest smells of actual work and actual purpose. This was where I still felt like myself. The back corner held a small living space I'd set up for late nights, a cot, a hot plate, a bathroom with a shower that produced lukewarm water on a good day. It wasn't much. But it was completely and entirely mine, in a way the Buckhead house had never come close to being. When I set my duffel bags down on the concrete floor, I felt something release in my chest for the first time in years. The weeks that followed blurred together in a combination of physical work and emotional recovery that I couldn't have untangled even if I'd tried. I threw myself into the job with everything I had, taking on repairs that other mechanics had written off as hopeless, pushing my body to the edge of exhaustion every single day so I'd be too spent at night to lie awake replaying Miranda and Vince in every way I'd failed to become the man she wanted. Word got around. The Port Authorities started routing more work my way. Daniel Wright could fix anything. He didn't walk away from a job. His pricing was fair and his work was solid. There was something deeply satisfying about restoring broken things, taking equipment the world had written off and making it run again. Every engine I brought back, every hydraulic system I put right, every machine I returned to service felt like a small, quiet victory against decay. I understood machines in a way I'd never quite managed to understand people. Could diagnose problems by sound alone. Could feel when something was failing before it actually failed. If only people came with fault codes and repair manuals. Maybe I would have seen what was happening with Miranda long before I did. The other mechanics started calling me the miracle worker, half a joke, but with real respect underneath it. Old Jack Patterson, who'd spent 40 years working ships and cranes, told me one afternoon that he hadn't come across talent like mine since his own mentor had retired back in the 80s. A young guy named Marcus, who reminded me of an earlier version of myself, started hanging around my bay after hours asking questions they didn't cover in any trade school curriculum. Without really planning to, I became a teacher, passing along knowledge that had taken me years of trial and error and dirty hands to accumulate. In whatever free time I had, I studied engineering manuals, technical documents on hydraulics and automated systems. I filled the hours I'd once spent trying to meet Miranda's standards with knowledge that would actually hold up. The local community college offered night classes in mechanical engineering, and I enrolled in as many as my schedule allowed, sitting in rooms full of students half my age, absorbing everything. My professors figured out quickly that I wasn't there to check a box. I wanted to understand the principles underneath the procedures. Some of them started staying late to go deeper with me, covering material that never made it into the standard syllabus. My hands were permanently stained with grease. My back ached every morning from the demands of the work. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was actually constructing something, not maintaining an illusion. The cot in the back of the workshop became my home. A spare, stripped-down existence that would have horrified Miranda, and that suited me perfectly. Simple meals. Clean, organized space. And slowly, day by day, I started remembering who I'd been before I'd tried to reshape myself into someone else's idea of acceptable. Miranda called 3 times that first week. I let every call roll to voicemail without listening to the messages. Her texts swung from fury to remorse to legal threats, a whiplash of emotional pressure that would have worked on me a month earlier and now just seemed exhausting. She showed up at the workshop once, hammering on the door, demanding to be let in. I'd already changed the locks and had a security system installed with help from some military contacts. Eventually she got back in her leased Mercedes and drove away. The divorce papers came back signed 10 days after I'd left them on the coffee table. When I saw her signature next to mine, all I felt was relief. The thing about hitting bottom is that once you're there, the only available direction is up. And I started climbing with a focus that surprised even me. I invested my modest savings into upgrading the workshop, better equipment, better tools. I hired a helper, a kid named Tommy from a rough part of Savannah who'd grown up in his father's garage and had that same hungry look in his eyes I remembered from my own reflection at that age. Together we started landing bigger contracts. More complicated work. The kind that required creativity and problem solving, not just brute force mechanical skill. 3 months after I left Miranda, I was driving back from a parts run near Charleston when the hurricane arrived with almost no warning. The forecast had it curving northeast, missing the coast entirely. But hurricanes make their own decisions about where they want to go. And this one had apparently decided it wanted to introduce itself personally to anyone foolish enough to still be on the road. The rain came down so hard my wipers couldn't keep pace even maxed out. The wind was pushing my truck around on the highway like it weighed nothing. I should have pulled over. Should have found an overpass or a parking structure and waited it out. But stubbornness had been thoroughly installed by the Marine Corps, and it doesn't uninstall easily. The road was almost empty, the sensible people having taken the warning seriously in a way I apparently hadn't. My headlights could barely cut through the wall of water in front of me. My hands were white-knuckled on the wheel. The radio had gone silent about 10 miles back, cutting off right in the middle of a weather update that was almost certainly advising people to stay home. Lightning split the sky in patterns that seemed to hang in the air for seconds before the thunder followed, so loud it went straight through your ribs. The sedan came out of nowhere. A silver flash spinning across the flooded highway like something frictionless, like a puck crossing ice. I watched it happen in that stretched out slow motion that trauma always seems to produce. The car losing the argument with physics. Sliding through the guardrail at the edge of a steep drop-off as if the barrier were made of cardboard rather than reinforced steel. It went over the edge, tumbling, at least twice that I could track, before the darkness swallowed it. Even over the noise of the storm, I caught the sound, crumpling metal, shattering glass, and then the heavy silence of something that had come to rest somewhere it was never meant to be. I pulled over without even consciously deciding to. My body was already moving, every piece of training I'd ever received firing at once, the same surge of locked-in calm that had carried me through ambushes and firefights and every other situation where falling apart would have gotten people killed. The rain soaked me through in seconds. The wind nearly knocked me sideways as I made my way to the broken guardrail. None of it registered. There was a person, or people, in that vehicle, and there was a window of time, and everything else was just noise. The embankment was steep and slick with mud. I half climbed and half slid my way down to where the car had come to rest against a cluster of pine trees. The front end had crumpled like an accordion. The headlights were somehow still on, throwing strange beams through the rain and mist. The smell of gasoline was sharp enough to sting the eyes. There was a woman inside. Visible through the shattered driver's side window, unconscious, slumped into her seatbelt, blood running from a cut across her forehead. She looked to be in her 60s. Silver hair now matted dark with blood. Expensive jewelry catching what little light there was. The door was jammed solid. The impact had folded the frame. I had to use everything I had to wrench it open, feeling the metal fight me and then finally surrender with a shriek that cut through the storm. Getting her out was like solving a puzzle designed to stay unsolved, working around deployed airbags and bent metal, trying to move her without torquing her spine in case she'd taken damage to her back. The rain made everything slippery. I nearly lost my grip on her twice. But eventually I had her free, and I was carrying her up the embankment with every muscle screaming and my lungs burning. By the time the ambulance arrived, I'd been doing CPR for what felt like a long time, probably closer to 15 minutes. The paramedics had to physically pull me back before I'd stop. One of them said something about her pulse being faint but there, about how close she'd been to not making it, about how my being there had likely made the difference. I barely processed any of it. I just sat down in the rain at the edge of the road and watched them load her in and drive away, lights and sirens going. At the hospital, I sat in the waiting room in soaking wet clothes, leaving small puddles on the floor, collecting disapproving looks from the night staff that I was too drained to care about. Hours went by. At some point someone brought me a blanket and a cup of coffee that tasted like it had been brewed during a previous decade, but it was warm and it had caffeine and that made it acceptable. I couldn't have explained why I stayed. Marines don't leave casualties behind. Maybe it was that. Maybe it was just basic decency. Or maybe it was something I wouldn't understand until later. The doctor who finally came to speak with me looked like a man who'd been awake far too long. Bloodshot eyes, stethoscope around his neck like it had grown there. He asked if I was family. I explained what had happened out on the road, and watched his expression shift from professional neutral to something that looked like actual respect. She's stable, he said. But she lost a significant amount of blood, and she has a rare blood type. We're running low and the storm has complicated getting more. What type? I asked. I didn't know why it mattered. Something in me just needed to know. AB negative, he said. Under 1% of the population. Something clicked in the back of my mind. Military medical processing. Blood typing, standard procedure. That's my type, I said. AB negative. I can donate. He looked at me the way you look at something that shouldn't exist but clearly does. Minutes later I was in a room with a nurse who had kind eyes and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. She made small talk while the bag filled, asking about the accident, the rescue, how I'd ended up being both the Good Samaritan and the compatible donor in the same night. It's almost like fate, she said, smiling in a way that told you she genuinely believed that was possible. I was about to give her my standard response, the one that takes shape in a man who's watched too much random death to believe in anything so tidy. But then a different doctor came in, younger, with an urgent expression. The patient is stable, he said, but our lab flagged something unusual in the compatibility analysis. We need to run additional tests on both samples. I didn't think much of it. Some technical medical thing that would resolve itself. But when the results came back the following morning, they didn't resolve anything. They detonated everything I thought I knew about my own life. The woman I had pulled from that ravine was named Sarah Wright. And according to the DNA testing the hospital had run as part of their standard verification process, she was my biological mother. Let me explain just how impossible that felt in the moment, how thoroughly it contradicted the entire architecture of my understanding of who I was. I had been raised by James and Mary Wright in small-town rural Georgia. Had grown up believing without question that I was their son. Had no reason, ever, to doubt it. My father had died when I was 16, heart attack out in the fields, and my mother had followed him 4 years later, hollowed out by grief and the relentless burden of trying to hold the farm together alone. The idea that I hadn't been their biological child. That I had been taken as an infant and raised by someone else entirely. That my real mother was a wealthy woman who had been searching for me for 3 decades, it felt less like reality and more like a premise someone had pitched to a television network. But DNA doesn't negotiate. And as Sarah recovered over the following days, the actual story of where I came from began to surface. I had been taken from a shopping cart outside an Atlanta supermarket at 8 months old. Snatched by a woman named Mary Wright, whose own infant had died of SIDS just weeks before, and whose grief had cracked something fundamental in her perception of what was real and what she was allowed to do. The police investigation had stalled. The woman who took me had vanished into the rural quiet of Georgia farm country, and Sarah Wright had spent the 30 years since refusing to stop looking. We sat together in her hospital room on the 3rd day, both of us still trying to make the math work on what had happened. She was sitting up now, head bandaged, eyes clear and sharp with an intelligence that the trauma and medication hadn't managed to dim. I'm not going to pretend this isn't strange, I said, because I had never been good at softening things and couldn't think of a reason to start. I didn't pull you out of that car because I was looking for a mother. I didn't know you existed. I did it because leaving you there wasn't something I was capable of doing. Sarah looked at me for a long moment, the kind of look that's actually an assessment. Measuring you. Taking stock. Deciding whether you're worth the investment of her trust. I know, she said. If you'd known exactly who I was, you would have done the same thing. I can see that in you. You have your father's eyes, did you know that? Richard passed 12 years ago. But I still catch him in the mirror sometimes, and now I'm catching him in yours. She told me about her life, the logistics company she'd rebuilt after Richard's death, turning a modest trucking operation into a multi-state enterprise that moved cargo from one end of the country to the other. She told me about the investigators she'd hired over the years, the dead ends, the false leads, the slow and painful process of learning to hold hope loosely without letting it go entirely. And she told me about the grandchildren she'd imagined giving Richard, the legacy she'd wanted to extend, the particular kind of emptiness that success never quite managed to fill. I can't return your childhood to you, she said, and even after 30 years, the grief in her voice was real and close. I can't undo what happened, not to you, not to me, not to your father. But there's something else I can give you, if you'll take it. The resources to build whatever future you actually want. It would have been easy to be suspicious. To wonder if she was trying to purchase my goodwill, or position me for something I couldn't yet see. But I'd spent enough time with her by then to recognize the kind of core strength she carried, the same uncompromising backbone I'd developed through my own years of hard service. She wasn't offering me rescue. She was offering me a partnership. A chance to demonstrate what I was worth, and that demonstration would have nothing to do with whose blood I carried. I'm not interested in being handed things, I told her. I've been self-sufficient since I was 20, and I'm not looking to change that. Sarah smiled, and it was the first time I'd seen genuine approval in her expression. I'd be concerned if you were. What I'm offering isn't charity, Daniel. It's an investment. I've spent 4 decades building something real, and I need someone who can help me push it further. Someone who knows what hard work actually is. Someone who's not afraid to be in the thick of it. Everything I've heard about you in these last few days tells me that's exactly who you are. The terms we agreed on were clear. Sarah would put up the capital to transform my workshop into a serious industrial operation. In return, I'd work alongside her company to develop new technology for the logistics sector. She'd hold 49% of the new venture. I'd control 51%, and no major decision would move without both of us signing off. Equal partnership. Not a parent bailing out a son. And that distinction mattered more to me than I had language for. We spent hours in that hospital room hammering out the specifics, and I came away genuinely impressed by her, by how precisely she understood her industry, which innovations actually created value versus which ones were just technology in search of a problem to justify itself. When I walked her through the ideas I'd been developing in my head during all those night classes at the community college, she didn't wave them off as too ambitious. She asked hard questions that forced me to confront the implementation problems I'd been conveniently skating around. Over the months that followed, I turned that small Savannah workshop into something that made my previous operation look like a hobby space. With Sarah's capital behind it, I brought in serious equipment, hired skilled technicians, and started chasing the engineering innovations I'd been dreaming about for years. We called it Right Systems, a name that honored both where we came from and what we were building together. The transformation was intense in the best possible way. We broke ground on a new facility in March, a purpose-built manufacturing complex that would eventually employ over 200 people and ship product to ports around the world. I personally oversaw every phase of construction, from the foundation pour to the final electrical hookups. The contractors learned fast that I wasn't the kind of owner who signed checks and disappeared. I'd show up unannounced at any hour. My standards weren't a guideline. They were the floor. The work demanded everything from me, physical and mental, hands and mind, and I found that deeply satisfying in a way that was hard to explain to people who hadn't experienced the alternative. I developed hydraulic systems that outperformed anything currently on the market. I built robotic maintenance equipment that could handle operations that had previously required whole crews. I filed patents for innovations that major logistics companies were already getting in line to license. Tommy, my first hire from the early Savannah days, turned out to be irreplaceable. In less than a year he'd gone from shop assistant to floor manager to head of the entire manufacturing division. I recruited engineers from universities across the Southeast, offering them real problems to solve instead of incremental improvements to things that already worked well enough. The company grew faster than any reasonable projection would have predicted, and within 12 months we had contracts with 3 of the biggest shipping companies on the eastern seaboard. Sarah watched it all develop with a satisfaction that ran deeper than business results. I understood, by then, that Right Systems meant something to her beyond revenue and market position. It was evidence. Proof that the decades between us hadn't cost her son the potential she'd always believed he had. Meanwhile, the life Miranda had chosen was quietly coming apart. The first signs surfaced about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, whispers through professional networks about irregularities at her firm. I dismissed them at first. Successful people attract jealousy. But the whispers got louder and more specific, and eventually I couldn't keep not hearing them. Vince Caldwell, it turned out, was not the financial mastermind he'd spent years presenting himself as at gallery openings and charity galas. He was a professional predator. A con artist who had built his entire career around identifying insecure, ambitious people and systematically separating them from their money. The revolutionary opportunity he'd been pitching was a pyramid scheme, an elegant house of cards that would function perfectly until the moment it didn't, and then collapse completely. Miranda, blinded by her attraction to Vince and her hunger to climb higher, had made the catastrophic error of putting not just her own savings into his venture, but client funds. She'd falsified documents, forged signatures, committed fraud at a scale that was almost impressive in its scope. When the structure finally gave way, as it was always going to, she was standing at the center of the wreckage. The firm fired her immediately. Licensing boards pulled her credentials with a speed that left skid marks. Banks foreclosed on the Buckhead house, took back the Mercedes, and froze every account she had access to. The crowd that had surrounded her at that gallery opening, all those laughing, well-dressed people who had watched her humiliate me without saying a word, became suddenly, universally unavailable. Full calendars. Unanswered calls. The whole performance. I'd be lying if I told you I felt nothing when I learned all of this. I didn't achieve some clean spiritual detachment from the suffering of a woman who had put me through what she'd put me through. What I felt was more complicated than that. A tangle of vindication and sadness and something that might have grown into actual compassion if I'd let it. She had treated me badly. That was real. But she was also still a human being in serious pain, and I wasn't entirely sure what kind of man I wanted to be when faced with that. The question got sharper about 10 months after the divorce, when Miranda walked into the Right Systems lobby on a Tuesday afternoon. She looked nothing like the person who had commanded rooms at corporate events and gallery openings. Her clothes were creased. Her makeup was uneven. The dark circles under her eyes told you she hadn't had a real night's sleep in weeks. The front desk tried to turn her away. Miranda made enough noise that security eventually called me to come handle it. We sat in my office, a space built for function, not display, all engineering diagrams and prototype components rather than curated art and framed accomplishments. She looked around at what I'd built with an expression that seemed to be fighting a war between resentment and calculation. I waited for her to go first, because patience in negotiations was another thing the Corps had given me. Danny, she started, the nickname she always reached for when she needed something from me. I know things ended badly. But we were married for 7 years. That has to count for something. I'm in real trouble. Serious trouble. And there's no one else I can go to. Vince is gone, took everything and disappeared. Now they're saying I'm the one who designed the whole thing. Danny, I could actually go to prison. She leaned forward, and I could see her sliding into the version of herself that had worked on me effectively for years, the mode she switched on when she wanted something she knew was a long shot. I'm not asking for money, she said, in the tone of someone who is absolutely asking for money. I just need help navigating this. Someone with the right connections, who can point me toward the right lawyers, the right people. You've always been the one who could fix things, Danny. Fix this for me, and I'll do whatever you want. We could start fresh. Be the real partners we never quite managed to be. I was foolish to let Vince get between us. I listened to every word the way you'd watch a film you've already seen, observing the craft of the performance without being moved by it. When she finished, she leaned back with the confidence of someone who had never truly been refused anything she'd committed to pursuing. Do you remember what you said to me at the Hartwell Gallery? I asked, keeping my voice even. Something crossed her face that might have been shame, if it had been allowed to stay. It didn't. I was drinking, she said. I was performing for my colleagues. I didn't mean any of it. You meant every single word, I said. You'd been meaning it for years. That night you just finally stopped editing yourself. And honestly, Miranda, I'm grateful for it. Hearing you say it out loud was the best thing that ever happened to me. It showed me with complete clarity what I was actually dealing with. What our marriage had actually become. And it gave me everything I needed to walk away. I got up and stood at the window, looking out over the industrial complex that had grown from a small converted warehouse into something I was genuinely proud of. I'm not going to help you, I said. Not out of anger. Not for revenge. I'm not going to help you because you never actually wanted a partner. You wanted someone to serve you. And I'm done playing that role. Miranda's composure cracked. What was underneath it was raw and desperate. "You owe me," she said, her voice climbing. "I stood by you through all those years when you were just a mechanic working the docks. I dealt with your nightmares and your moods and your complete inability to exist in normal society. You owe me." "I don't owe you a thing," I said, and the words came easily, without effort. "I worked double shifts for 2 years to put a down payment on a house you wanted. I sacrificed everything I cared about to try to make you happy. I gave you everything I had, and you used it against me in front of 50 strangers. If I ever owed you anything, that debt was settled in full that night." I reached for the intercom. "Security, I need you to escort my visitor out. She's overstayed her welcome." The guards handled it professionally, firm and calm, steering Miranda toward the exit while she announced things about lawyers and injustice and consequences I would regret. I watched her go without feeling much of anything. Just a quiet, settled certainty that I had done the right thing. The legal proceedings got significant local media coverage, though I made a deliberate choice not to follow it closely. Vince had been picked up trying to cross into Canada with a bag full of cash and a collection of fraudulent passports. He'd moved quickly to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a better deal, his cooperation consisting mostly of redirecting blame at everyone within reach. Miranda ended up facing a charge list that was extensive and damning. I showed up to the sentencing hearing without being entirely sure why. Closure, maybe. Curiosity. Or just the human need to witness the end of a story that had consumed so much of your life. The courtroom was sparsely filled, a handful of journalists, a few of Vince's other victims who'd come looking for whatever resolution a sentencing can actually provide. Miranda's former colleagues were nowhere to be found. Their association with her had apparently been quietly reclassified from asset to liability. Miranda looked smaller than I'd ever seen her. The orange jumpsuit and the handcuffs had stripped away the architecture of her identity, the clothes, the makeup, the carefully maintained projection of competence and arrival. What remained was a woman in her mid-30s who had made a sequence of choices that had demolished her life, sitting in a courtroom waiting to learn the full damage. Her attorney made the usual arguments: remorse, circumstances, the outsized influence of Vince Caldwell. Cast her as a victim who had been manipulated into complicity. But the evidence didn't leave much room for that reading. Emails she'd written. Documents she'd signed. Phone recordings where she discussed, in specific terms, how to keep regulators from looking too closely. Whatever pressure Vince had applied, Miranda had been a knowing and active participant in stealing millions from people who had trusted her. The judge was a woman who had no patience for white-collar predators. 12 years in federal prison. Parole possible after 8, contingent on exceptional conduct. When the number landed, Miranda went pale. She looked around the courtroom the way people do when they're hoping someone will step forward and declare a mistake has been made. Her eyes found mine. We looked at each other across the courtroom for a moment. I thought about the woman I had actually married, the one with bright eyes and a genuine enthusiasm for my military background, who had made me feel like I was enough exactly as I was. I wondered what had happened to her. Whether she had ever really existed in the way I'd believed, or whether I'd wanted so badly to be loved that I'd constructed qualities that weren't there. She didn't find whatever she was looking for in my expression. I wasn't offering satisfaction at her downfall. Wasn't offering pity either. What I was feeling, mostly, was exhausted. Exhausted by the history, the emotion, the weight of everything our shared years had cost both of us. A television on the courtroom wall was running the local news, sound off. I glanced at it while the bailiffs moved to take Miranda out, and did a double take at what was on the screen. There I was, standing next to Sarah at the grand opening of a veterans support center that Right Systems had funded in downtown Savannah. The Chiron identified us as local business leaders give back to community. Sarah was smiling as she cut the ribbon. I was standing beside her in a suit that actually fit, looking more at ease in my own skin than I had at any point during my marriage. I hadn't thought of that day as anything particularly significant when we'd planned it, just the most logical thing I could do with the gratitude I felt toward the Corps and the desire to do something useful for veterans who were struggling to land on the other side of service. But watching it on that screen, set against the backdrop of what Miranda's choices had produced, something became very clear to me about the roads people take and where those roads eventually go. The center would offer housing, job training, and mental health resources to veterans in the Savannah area, services I knew from direct personal experience were desperately needed and chronically underfunded. We'd staffed it with counselors who specialized in PTSD, employment professionals who actually understood how military experience translated to civilian work, and housing advocates who knew the veterans benefits system from the inside out. Sarah had been firm that we fund it properly, not as a public relations exercise, but as a genuine commitment to doing something that mattered. The building was nothing fancy. Solid, functional, designed to serve its purpose well. Sound engineering principles, applied to a human problem. I thought about the men I had served alongside who had come home and found that what they'd learned in combat didn't map cleanly onto any job listing. The ones who'd ended up on the street, or incarcerated, or gone by their own hands because no one had been positioned to help them make the crossing from one life to another. This center wouldn't reach all of them. But it would reach some. And some was enough to make it worth everything we'd put into it, many times over. When the hearing wrapped up and Miranda was taken away to begin her sentence, I left the courthouse and drove to the waterfront. Parked near the docks where I had once been a mechanic with a failing marriage and no clear way forward, and walked out onto a pier that stretched into the Atlantic. The water was calm. The late afternoon light was breaking across the surface in shifting gold and blue. I stood there for a long time, watching it move. Sarah found me about an hour later. Of course she did. She'd spent 30 years looking for me, and she wasn't about to misplace me now that she'd found me. The sentencing was today, she said, stepping up beside me. It was. Are you okay? I took the question seriously before I answered it, because Sarah had earned honesty and I had learned through hard experience that glossing over your actual emotional state only creates larger problems further down the road. I don't feel good about what happened to her, I said. I don't feel bad about it either. I think mostly I just feel finished. The chapter is closed. The story ended. And I'm ready for whatever comes next. Sarah nodded. She understood that on a level that went past words. She'd spent decades of her own life waiting for closure on something that had felt unresolvable. She knew that some wounds don't fully heal, but can eventually stop bleeding if you give them enough time and enough care. There's something I've been wanting to give you, she said, reaching into her coat and producing a small velvet box. Your father, your biological father, Richard, had this made when I was pregnant. He was completely certain you were going to be a boy, and he wanted you to have something that would connect you to the family history. Inside the box was a pocket watch. Antique. Clearly valuable. The Wright family crest engraved into the case. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it, all that history and expectation and something that felt like the first real sign of a future that was, finally, 38 years late, starting to open up. He would have been proud of you, Sarah said. I know that probably doesn't land the way it might coming from someone who knew him. But I spent 25 years with that man, and I know exactly the kind of son he was hoping for. You're it, Daniel. You're exactly that. I put the watch in my pocket. Felt it settle against my hip like something anchoring me to something larger than myself. The sun was getting low now, painting the sky in colors that seemed too vivid to be real. I watched the light fade and the first stars appear in the darkening sky above the water. I spent so long trying to be what Miranda needed me to be, I said, the words coming slowly, because I was working through something I hadn't quite fully said out loud yet. The wardrobe she wanted. The way she wanted me to talk, to move, to take up space. Trying to transform into someone I was never made to be. The whole time thinking that if I just worked hard enough at it, if I just changed enough, she'd eventually see me. Really see me. Sarah listened without interrupting. That particular skill, just being present and not filling silence with noise, was one of the things I'd come to value most in her. But that was never going to happen, I said. Because Miranda wasn't actually looking at me. She was looking at a mirror. She was projecting her own ambitions and her own fears onto someone who was standing right there in front of her, wanting to be seen. I could have turned myself completely inside out and she still would have missed me, because she had no interest in who I actually was. She was attached to the version of me she'd scripted in her own head. I turned to face Sarah directly. Saw the understanding in her eyes. But you see me, I said. From that very first day in the hospital, before you had any idea who I was, you looked at me like I was someone worth actually knowing. Not a project. Not a problem. A person who had his own worth and his own place in the world. That's what mothers do, Sarah said quietly. Even when they've missed the first 37 years. We stood there a while longer as the stars multiplied and the moon came up over the ocean that had seen so much of Savannah's long history. Somewhere behind us in that city, Wright Systems was humming along, building technology that was starting to reshape the logistics industry and supporting hundreds of workers who counted on us. Somewhere in a federal facility, Miranda was beginning to reckon with the consequences of decisions made in pursuit of a success that had never been real. And somewhere in the space inside my chest where I had carried the weight of rejection and inadequacy for so long, something lighter had taken up residence. Something that felt, for the first time in a long time, like peace. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the cheap lighter Miranda had given me years ago. The only gift she had ever chosen herself, not through an assistant, not from a list someone had curated for her. A gas station impulse buy that she'd wrapped in newspaper and handed me on our first Christmas together, back when we were too broke for anything more and it hadn't mattered. I'd carried it ever since. Not because it had any monetary value, but because it had once meant something. Because it reminded me of a time when the possibility of us had still seemed real. I flipped it open. Watched the flame hold against the evening breeze. Then closed it, drew my arm back, and sent it out over the water in a clean arc. It landed somewhere out in the dark with a sound too small to hear from where I was standing. I didn't watch for where it hit. That part didn't matter. What mattered was the letting go. Story 3. My wife won top salesperson at her father's company. At dinner, she embarrassed me. How does it feel watching me succeed while you do nothing? Everyone laughed. Don't be upset. I'm just teasing. I replied, teasing is fun. Want to hear mine? I own 77% of your company, and now you're fired. Ever sat at your own dinner table getting absolutely torched while wearing a suit that costs more than some people's rent checks? Yeah. That was my Tuesday night. There I was, stuffed into a $1,200 Tom Ford suit that fit like a second skin, holding a champagne flute full of something that honestly tasted like it came out of a cardboard box with a tap, watching my wife Isabel soak up the spotlight over her latest so-called triumph, like she'd just split the atom or discovered electricity or something actually worth celebrating. Spoiler, she hit a sales target. Revolutionary stuff. Someone call the Nobel Committee. The Redwood Steakhouse was exactly the kind of place where waiters quietly judged you for ordering your steak well done, and the lighting was dim enough that reading the menu required night vision goggles. Everything about it screamed I'm loaded and I need the whole room to know it. Gold-trimmed plates, a chandelier that probably ran somebody a small fortune, the whole 9 yards. Isabel had picked this place because apparently hitting a quota at her daddy's company warranted the kind of fanfare normally reserved for Oscar wins and medical breakthroughs. Isn't this just incredible? Isabel practically shrieked, her voice cutting right through the ambient jazz that was really straining to sound classy. She was glowing, and not in the quiet, I'm proud of myself way. More like the everyone drop what you're doing and acknowledge me right now way. Her blonde hair was set in those flawless waves that required a whole crew of professionals and enough hairspray to do real damage to the atmosphere. Her dress was designer. I knew because she'd casually dropped the brand name roughly 47 times while getting ready. The table was stuffed with the usual crowd. Her father, Gerald Kinton, held court at the head of the table like some kind of boardroom monarch, his hairline retreating under the chandelier glow. He had that particular look you see on successful middle-aged men, the one that says I peaked somewhere around 1987 and I'm still coasting on it. Beside him sat Monica from accounting, whose entire personality was built around agreeing with whatever Isabel said, and Trevor from marketing, who had this maddening habit of clapping at completely wrong moments, like he'd been stuck in a pep rally for 20 years. Miles, Isabel grabbed my arm with a grip that looked affectionate and felt like a handcuff. Did you catch what Daddy just said? They're talking about making me regional director. That's wonderful, honey, I said, washing it down with a sip of disappointing champagne. I found myself wondering whether fancy restaurants did this on purpose, pour mediocre alcohol so the overpriced food seemed better by comparison. Some kind of psychological hustle disguised as fine dining. Talking about it? Gerald bellowed, the authority in his voice coming from a lifetime of never hearing no. She's already got it sewn up. My daughter, youngest regional director in Kinton Holdings history. He raised his glass like a signal flare, and everyone at the table scrambled to follow like some choreographed flash mob. Trevor clapped. Obviously. I smiled and nodded, playing the role of the supportive husband while quietly calculating whether these steaks were going to justify the heartburn I'd definitely be getting later. Isabel launched into a full breakdown of her latest sales strategy, dropping words like synergy and paradigm shift with the confidence of someone who'd inhaled one too many TED Talks. Her colleagues leaned in like she was unlocking the secrets of the cosmos, when really she was just describing how she'd talk some clients into contracts they probably didn't need. The real key, she said, waving her champagne glass around in a way that made me nervous about the tablecloth, is understanding what's hurting the client and presenting yourself as the cure. It's not brain surgery, but not everyone has the natural instinct for it. She looked at me when she said that last part. That look. The one that meant, unlike certain people sitting right here who coast through life doing absolutely nothing. I'd seen that look so many times I could have painted it from memory. Miles, you must be so proud, Monica chimed in, her voice dripping with the kind of artificial sweetness that makes your molars ache. Having such an accomplished wife. Oh, I'm drowning in it, I replied flatly. Seriously considering constructing a shrine. Isabel laughed, but there was an edge underneath it. He's kidding. But really, Miles has been incredibly supportive while I've been climbing. Haven't you, babe? The thing about loaded questions is they're landmines gift-wrapped in ribbon. No right answer exists. Agree too hard and you look pathetic. Push back and you're suddenly the villain. So I did what 3 years of marriage to Isabel Kinton had trained me to do. I smiled and said something that meant nothing in particular. I do what I can. Which is what, exactly? That came from Bryce, one of Isabel's sales department guys, with a smirk that said I drive a leased BMW and it defines me. No offense, man, but what do you actually do all day? The table went quiet. Not the good kind of quiet, the awful kind where everyone suddenly becomes very focused on their water glasses and the thread count of their napkins. Isabel jumped in before I could say anything. Miles does freelance work. Tech stuff, mostly. Very flexible schedule. Flexible. That was her go-to word for unemployed. Never mind that I'd sold a software company for enough money to buy myself a small island. Never mind that my investment portfolio dwarfed what most people in that room would accumulate over their entire lives. In Isabel and Gerald's world, if you weren't grinding through some corporate machine with a title and a corner office, you weren't really working. Tech stuff, Gerald repeated, the way you'd repeat I collect dryer lint, a combination of pity and mild disgust. Well, that's nice. Trevor clapped again. I was beginning to think it was involuntary. The food arrived, obscenely expensive cuts of meat arranged on plates like modern art, the kind of pretentious cuisine where you need a magnifying glass to locate your actual meal. Isabel kept holding court, treating everyone to her greatest professional hits while I worked on my steak and wondered if this was what purgatory felt like. Expensive, uncomfortable, and full of people who use disruption as a personality trait. Then came dessert, and with it the moment that blew everything up. Isabel stood up, champagne glass raised, face flushed from wine and self-admiration. I want to make a toast, she announced, and the entire table immediately snapped to attention like she was about to read from a sacred text. To strong women who lift men up by showing them exactly how it's done. The table lost it. Gerald nearly choked on his scotch. Monica applauded right along with Trevor, producing a symphony of pure enabling behavior. Then Isabel turned to me, eyes gleaming with that particular flavor of cruelty people like to dress up as playfulness. So, Miles, go ahead and tell everyone, what's it actually feel like, watching me succeed while you sit home doing nothing all day? The whole table leaned forward, waiting to watch me squirm. A few faces showed some discomfort, but most were barely keeping a straight face. This was entertainment. The Successful Wife and Her Dead-Weight Husband, a comedy for our times. Let me back up and paint you the full picture of my life before that dinner where I metaphorically set fire to my wife's entire sense of reality. Around Kinton Holdings, I was essentially invisible. Not in the cool, superhero way. More like the why did someone bring him? Way that makes you question every decision that led you here. People knew me as Isabel's +1, the husband who showed up to company functions in nice clothes, smiled politely, and nodded along while people talked about quarterly numbers and market share like it was the most riveting conversation since the invention of language. Oh, you're Isabel's husband, they'd say, as if that was the whole of me. As if I had no existence before she appeared, as if I'd been assembled specifically to hang off her arm at networking events. But here's the thing about doing nothing, it turns out it's actually very hard work when you're secretly running the entire show from behind a curtain, like some kind of financial Wizard of Oz. But I'm getting ahead of myself. See, while everyone at Kinton Holdings was busy treating me like some kind of stay-at-home trophy husband who spent his days gaming in his underwear and living off his wife's success, I was actually the majority shareholder of the whole company. Yeah. 77%. I own more of Kinton Holdings than Gerald Kinton himself, which was particularly funny given his name was literally on the building. How did that happen? Grab something to snack on, because this story runs circles around anything on Netflix right now. It started when Gerald made some genuinely catastrophic investment decisions that would make a compulsive gambler look financially responsible. The man had been throwing company money at every trendy startup that showed up with a pitch deck, convinced he was going to become the next great venture capitalist. Blockchain dog walking apps. Subscription boxes for artisanal air. I wish I was making that up. He literally put money into a company selling premium air from exotic locations in fancy little bottles, like Goop, but somehow even more unhinged. Naturally, every single one of these visionary investments tanked harder than the Titanic hitting a second iceberg. Suddenly Kinton Holdings was hemorrhaging cash at a rate that gives accountants actual nightmares. The company was circling the drain and making gurgling noises about it. Banks were calling. Creditors were sharpening their knives. Gerald was sweating through his tailored suits and probably nursing an ulcer the size of a small state. This was back in 2017, when I still held out some hope that my marriage to Isabel might actually be built on mutual respect rather than her treating me like a pet rock she kept around for tax purposes. I'd recently cashed out of a software company I'd built from the ground up, a lean cybersecurity firm that had caught the eye of some serious players in Silicon Valley. Nothing flashy, just real technology solving real problems instead of vaporware designed to separate investors from their money. The exit had left me comfortable enough to retire and maybe acquire a decent yacht, a substantial house, or enough therapy to process my in-laws for the rest of my natural life. But I wasn't the retiring type. And definitely not the yacht type. I was more the let's see where this goes type, which is probably the reason I ended up here in the first place. Gerald came to me one night, sweating and desperate, like a man who'd just realized the house was burning and his pants were still inside. He pulled me aside at some family dinner, probably one where Isabel had spent 3 hours walking everyone through her latest career victory, and asked if we could speak privately. We ended up in his home office, which was styled like a movie set designed by someone whose entire vision of wealth came from 1980s thrillers: dark wood, leather chairs, those crystal decanters that nobody actually pours from but everyone owns. "Miles," he said, pouring himself a serious measure of scotch that probably cost more than my first car. "I need your help." Now, Gerald had never needed anything from me before. He'd made it abundantly clear over the years that he viewed me roughly the way you view a piece of furniture, technically there, occasionally functional, but not really worth a meaningful conversation. So hearing him admit he needed me was like watching a cat ask a mouse for directions. "What kind of help?" I asked, genuinely intrigued by what could make a man like Gerald Kinton humble himself enough to come to his underachieving son-in-law. That's when it all came out. The bad bets, the mounting debt, the creditors circling like sharks who'd caught a whiff of blood. Kinton Holdings was in serious trouble, the kind that ends with bankruptcy hearings and your name becoming shorthand for poor judgment. He needed a silent investor, someone who could inject enough capital to stabilize things while he figured out how to stop the bleeding. "I can't let this go public," he said, his voice cracking a little. "If the board finds out how bad it really is, they'll push me out. If our clients catch wind of it, they'll run. I need someone I trust. Family, who can help without making waves. Family." That was rich. This was a man who'd spent years treating me like a stray dog Isabel had dragged home. But I'm not petty. Okay, I'm extremely petty. But I'm also a businessman. And I could smell an opportunity when it walked up and slapped me with a balance sheet. "What are you offering?" I asked. He offered shares. A lot of them. Controlling interest, actually, in exchange for enough cash to clear the immediate debts and keep the lights on while he restructured. He was desperate enough to hand over the keys to the kingdom to save it, probably assuming I'd be a passive investor who'd collect dividend checks and stay out of the way. I accepted. Obviously. But here's where it gets good. I didn't just become a shareholder. I became the shareholder, with majority control of the entire operation. And I did it through a chain of holding companies and shell corporations that made an offshore tax haven look like a simple Excel spreadsheet. That's where Priya came in. Priya Sharma was my accountant, and calling her just an accountant was like calling Michelangelo some guy who liked ceilings. This woman could make money move and reappear in entirely different places like she was doing card tricks with spreadsheets. She had more credentials than most people have names, and she approached tax law the way a chess grandmaster approaches a tournament, relentlessly, strategically, without mercy. "You want to own this company without anyone knowing you own it?" she asked when I laid it all out. That's basically my favorite thing in the world. She built a web of holding entities so layered and complex it made Russian nesting dolls look like a beginner's puzzle. LLCs stacked inside other LLCs, trusts holding shares through intermediary vehicles, the full package. On paper, the ownership structure of Kinton Holdings looked like a bunch of boring corporate names that meant nothing to anyone. My name appeared nowhere near the top. But I was there. Oh, I was absolutely there. 77% ownership, voting rights and everything. I could fire anyone, greenlight any major decision, veto anything I didn't like. I was running the show, except instead of strings, I had bylaws and shareholder agreements. And I pulled all of this off while Isabel thought I was grinding through freelance coding gigs. Every time she asked what I was working on, I'd mumble something about debugging or algorithm optimization, and her eyes would go blank within about 4 seconds, like I'd started speaking ancient Sumerian. She had zero interest in what I actually did, which made the whole secret owner thing embarrassingly easy to maintain. The best part? Gerald knew I held the majority stake, but we'd structured the deal so he could still run day-to-day operations as long as the company stayed healthy. Staying out of the spotlight worked for everyone. No board meetings, no strategy sessions. Just a protected investment and a very, very patient game. All right, let's rewind back to 2017. A great year. People were still pretending fidget spinners were an investment vehicle and everyone thought crypto was about to replace cash. It was also the year Gerald Kinton's financial empire came within inches of collapsing like a house of cards in a wind tunnel, and I quietly became the secret owner of his entire operation without a single person noticing. Picture this, Tuesday afternoon in March. I'm sitting in my home office, which was really just the spare bedroom Isabel had grudgingly let me convert into a workspace, on the condition I kept it presentable in case company came over. My phone rings. Unknown number. Normally I'd let it go to voicemail, because the only calls from unknown numbers are either scam robots telling me my car's extended warranty is dying or other robots with strong opinions about my student loans. But something made me pick this one up. Miles Brooks, I said, leaning back in my chair. Miles, it's Gerald. His voice sounded like he'd been gargling gravel soaked in anxiety. We need to meet in person today if you can manage it. Now, Gerald didn't do spontaneous. This man had his schedule locked down 3 days in advance and probably ran his morning coffee on a flow chart. Hearing him sound frantic and disorganized was like watching a penguin suddenly take flight, theoretically possible, but genuinely unsettling. Sure, I said, glancing at my calendar, which was, let's be real, completely empty. Come to my office. 6 o'clock. And Miles, he paused. Don't mention this to Isabel. Oh. Now that was interesting. Gerald never kept anything from his daughter. She was his golden child, his protégé, the one who could do no wrong even when she did everything wrong. If he was cutting her out, something had truly broken. I showed up at Kinton Holdings headquarters at exactly 6, wearing jeans and a button-down, because I'd long since figured out that dressing too formally made people nervous while dressing too casually made them dismissive. The building was one of those modern glass stacks that looked like someone had piled transparent boxes on top of each other and called it innovation. Very look how forward-thinking we are while being completely generic. The receptionist, a young guy named Marcus who permanently looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth, barely glanced up as I walked through. Mr. Kinton's expecting you. Top floor. The elevator ride gave me time to wonder what fresh disaster I was walking into. Maybe Gerald wanted to float another one of his brilliant investment ideas. Maybe he was finally going to treat me like a person instead of his daughter's questionable life decision. Maybe aliens had made contact and he needed a tech guy to translate. Probably not that last one. Gerald's office was larger than my first apartment and furnished like a museum exhibit on the history of conspicuous wealth. The mahogany desk alone probably cost more than a luxury car, and the view stretched over the whole city like he was some corporate deity surveying his domain. Except his domain was currently on fire, financially speaking. He wasn't alone. Sitting across from his desk was a woman I'd never seen before. Mid-50s, steel gray hair and a sharp bob, a pantsuit that communicated I will dismantle you in court and enjoy every second of it. She had a leather briefcase open across her lap and the expression of someone who'd heard every excuse ever invented and wasn't impressed by any of them. Miles, this is Patricia Thornton, Gerald said, gesturing to her like he was introducing me to something genuinely ominous. She's our corporate attorney and she's going to walk you through the situation. Patricia looked me over with the kind of assessment normally reserved for livestock at auction. Mr. Brooks, Gerald tells me you recently sold a software company for a significant sum. Define significant, I said, dropping into one of the unnecessarily grand chairs. 7 figures, possibly 8. Her tone made it clear she already had the exact number memorized to the penny. Let's say I came out ahead, I replied, not interested in giving away information for nothing. She opened the briefcase and pulled out a folder thick enough to cause actual harm if thrown with enough force. Kinton Holdings is in financial distress. Severe distress. Mr. Kinton pursued several high-risk investments over the past 18 months that not only failed to generate returns but produced significant losses. How significant are we talking? I asked, though the shape of things was already coming into focus. 23 million, Gerald said it the way you'd confess something at a confessional. Give or take. I fought the urge to choke on my own surprise. 23 million. That wasn't a bad investment. That was a catastrophic collapse of judgment, the kind that usually comes with legal consequences. Good Lord, Gerald, I said. What exactly did you invest in? ICE futures for penguins? Various ventures, Patricia cut in smoothly. Blockchain applications, emerging market funds, several tech startups promising to revolutionize everything. The way she said revolutionize everything was exactly how most people say horse manure. Let me guess, I said. They didn't actually revolutionize anything except your cash reserves. Gerald had the basic decency to look embarrassed. His face was cycling through a reddish-purple progression that his cardiologist would definitely not have approved of. I thought I was diversifying. Positioning the company for future growth. Every analyst said tech was where you needed to be. Every analyst also said Pets.com was going to reshape commerce, I pointed out. We both know how that ended. Patricia seemed to appreciate that I wasn't sugarcoating anything. A brief flicker of a smile crossed her face before she snapped back to professional level terrifying. The point, Mr. Brooks, is that the company is now carrying substantial debt. We've managed to keep it quiet so far, but creditors are escalating. If word gets out, clients will panic, staff will bolt, and the whole operation implodes. And you're looking for me to do what exactly? I asked, though I was pretty sure I already knew. Save it, Gerald said flatly. I need someone I trust to inject capital and absorb the debt. Someone who won't go running to the board or the press and turn this into a circus. Someone like family, Patricia added. Her tone suggested she found the entire plan somewhere between questionable and genuinely reckless. I leaned back and acted like I was thinking it over, while my brain was already doing backflips and mapping out scenarios. This was an opportunity delivered to my doorstep with a bow on it. Gerald was desperate enough to offer me whatever I wanted, which meant I could negotiate from a position of strength for what might be the first time in our entire relationship. What's in it for me? I asked. Shares, Gerald said quickly. Substantial equity in the company. We can hammer out the specifics, but we're talking a meaningful ownership stake. How meaningful? He exchanged a glance with Patricia, who looked like she had objections but knew better than to voice them right now. Controlling interest. Majority stake. Enough to make this genuinely worth your time. I let that sit in the air for a moment, watching Gerald squirm in his $1,000 chair. This man, who'd spent years treating me like I was barely qualified to carry his daughter's purse, was now offering me control of his life's work. The irony was thick enough to slice and serve. I want 77%, I said. Patricia actually let out an audible gasp. Gerald turned a purple that was probably medically inadvisable. 77? Miles, that's not just controlling interest. That's total ownership. You're right, I agreed, perfectly cheerful about it. It is. But here's the reality, Gerald, you need me significantly more than I need you. I could walk out that door right now and go buy a house in Malibu. You, on the other hand, are about 3 months away from bankruptcy hearings and your name becoming synonymous with everything not to do in business. So yes, 77%. Take it or leave it. The silence that followed was exquisite. Patricia was looking at me with something approaching genuine respect. Gerald was running calculations that probably involved creative accounting and prayer. One more condition, I added. This stays completely quiet. My name doesn't appear anywhere near the public records. We structure this through holding companies, trusts, whatever it takes. As far as anyone's concerned, especially Isabel, I'm still just the guy who does freelance coding. Why? Gerald asked, genuinely baffled. I smiled. Let's just say I prefer operating off the radar. It's a lot more fun that way. Living with Isabel Kinton was like being permanently cast as the before photo in an infomercial where she was the miraculous product that fixed everything, except in this version, the product never stopped reminding you how broken you were and how fortunate you should feel that it even shared a room with you. Picture a typical Tuesday evening in the Brooks Kinton household. Yes, she used the hyphenated name, but only for herself. I was just Brooks, straight and simple, because apparently adding Kinton to my name would dilute her brand somehow. I'd be on our overpriced couch, the one she'd insisted we buy from some boutique furniture shop where the staff dressed entirely in black and made you feel personally responsible for climate change if you dared ask about the price, trying to read or watch something mindless on TV. Then Isabel would come home from work, and it was like someone had hit a switch labeled Activate Full Narcissism. Babe, you will not believe what happened today, she'd announce, dropping her designer bag on the counter with the kind of dramatic flair normally reserved for stage productions. She wouldn't wait for me to respond. That would require acknowledging I might have thoughts worth hearing. I landed the Henderson account. Do you understand how long people have been chasing Henderson? 2 years. 2 years. And I did it in 3 meetings. That's great, honey, I'd say, marking my page and resigning myself to another evening of the Isabel show. Great? Miles, it's career defining. It's legendary. Marcus from sales actually cried when he heard the news. Actual tears. Running down his actual face. She'd pour herself a glass of wine. Always white, always expensive, always sourced from some vineyard she'd discovered at a team building retreat that was really just a structured excuse to drink in Napa. Meanwhile, what did you get up to today? Let me guess, you worked on another coding project that will never actually launch. There it was. The little jab wrapped in a smile and a head tilt that was meant to look fond but landed more like a cobra measuring up a mouse. These little cuts were her specialty, tiny wounds dressed up as concern or teasing, designed to keep me aware of exactly where I stood in the household hierarchy. Something like that, I'd say, Because explaining that I'd actually spent the day reviewing quarterly reports from the company she worked for, the company I secretly owned, would have broken the beautiful spell of the whole thing. You know what you should really think about? She'd continue, settling onto the couch beside me but somehow still managing to seem like she was standing on an elevated platform. You should talk to Daddy about getting something at Kinton Holdings. I'm sure we could find a spot for you. Maybe in IT, you're decent with computers, right? The fact that after 3 years of marriage she could still reduce my entire professional history to decent with computers was both genuinely insulting and deeply funny. It was like calling a neurosurgeon pretty handy with sharp objects. I appreciate that, I'd say. But I'm good doing my own thing. Your own thing, she'd echo, with the tone someone uses when you've told them you're pursuing competitive thumb wrestling as a career. Miles, at some point you have to build something real. An actual career, not just freelance work scattered here and there. Don't you want to actually succeed at something? This was her favorite subject, my apparent lack of ambition. Never mind that I'd built and sold a software company currently running inside 3 Fortune 500 organizations. Never mind that my scattered freelance work had generated more wealth than most people see in multiple lifetimes. In Isabel's universe, success was measured in direct reports and the size of the font on your business card. I am successful, I'd point out, knowing full well it was pointless. I mean like me, babe. She'd give my leg a patronizing little pat that made me want to upend her wine glass onto the expensive couch just to watch the chaos unfold. I'm not trying to be harsh. I just want you to reach your potential. Not everybody is built to be a high achiever, that's fine. But you could at least try to do something with your life. The irony was so rich I could taste it. Here was Isabel giving me a lecture on ambition and achievement while every dollar of her prized salary technically came from me. The company she worked for, I owned it. The bonuses she bragged about, funded by my capital. The corner office she loved, I could convert it into a ball pit if I felt like it. But I never said a word. I just smiled and nodded and let her believe she was the one keeping our household afloat. Dinner conversations were their own special category of painful. Isabel had this habit of turning every meal into a TED talk about her latest professional conquest. She'd narrate every meeting, every email, every micro decision like she was recording the director's commentary on her own biopic. So then I told the client, she'd say, gesturing with her fork in ways that made me concerned for the walls, that if they wanted real market penetration, not the watered-down version their last vendor was giving them, they'd have to commit to our process. And guess what? They signed a 3-year contract on the spot. Market penetration, I'd repeat, working hard not to laugh at how seriously she took jargon that sounded like it came from corporate Mad Libs. It's about reading the landscape, Miles. Positioning yourself as irreplaceable, crafting value propositions that actually land with stakeholder priorities. She'd look at me with the patience of a teacher waiting for the slow kid to grasp basic math. Does that make sense to you? Every word, I'd lie, sipping my water and wondering if purgatory felt like this. Her father wasn't much of an improvement. Gerald called at least twice a week, and every conversation somehow looped back around to Isabel's accomplishments and my apparent lack of any. Miles, my boy, he'd boom through the phone speaker, because Isabel always put him on speaker whether I wanted that or not. You should swing by the office sometime. See how an actual company runs. Might spark some ideas for your little projects. My little projects. Sure. The projects that were currently the only reason his company still had lights to keep on. The worst stretch was watching Isabel with her colleagues at company functions. I'd get dragged along to happy hours and networking events, hovering awkwardly near the bar while Isabel held court like she was a visiting dignitary. Her coworkers would orbit around her, laughing a beat too loud at her average jokes and nodding along with her most basic observations like she just figured out how gravity worked. Isabel, that insight on client retention is genuinely brilliant, Monica from accounting would gush, eyes wide with manufactured wonder. Oh, it's really just common sense, Isabel would reply with a false modesty that convinced absolutely no one. You have to think strategically about managing relationships. Meanwhile I'd be off to the side, holding a beer and trying to reconstruct the series of decisions that had brought me to this exact moment. Sometimes people acknowledged my existence with strained small talk. So Miles, Trevor from marketing once asked me, halfway through his third craft IPA, what's it actually like being married to someone that driven? Like living with a hurricane, I answered honestly. Loud, destructive, and you never quite know when or where it's going to hit. He laughed like I was being charming. I wasn't. But here's what that bizarre double life gave me, perspective. While Isabel was busy climbing her ladder and measuring her worth in quarterly bonuses and sales rankings, I was playing an entirely different game. She thought success meant titles and visibility and making sure the whole room knew your name. I understood that success was really about leverage, patience, and the deep satisfaction of letting people write you off completely, right up until the moment you prove them catastrophically wrong. Every dismissive remark, every condescending comment, every time she introduced me as my husband who does tech stuff, I filed it away. Not purely out of spite, though let's be honest, spite was definitely part of the equation, but more because I knew that eventually, in some perfect moment, all of it was going to come back around in the most spectacular way possible. The invitation to Isabel's top salesperson celebration dinner landed exactly the way you'd expect from someone whose ego needed its own area code, a group text that she'd somehow managed to make sound like an imperial proclamation. Dinner this Saturday at Redwood Steakhouse, it read, loaded with champagne emojis and celebration poppers. 7 p.m. sharp. Celebrating my latest achievement. Dress code, impressive. Can't wait to celebrate with my favorite people. I was lying on the couch when it came through, watching a documentary about deep-sea creatures that were somehow less unsettling than my wife's event planning. My phone buzzed. I read the message and felt my soul attempt to exit my body through my eye sockets. Saturday? I called out to Isabel, who was in the bedroom somewhere deep inside whatever ritual required 17 different skincare products and cost more than most people's car payments. Yes, Saturday, she yelled back, her voice muffled by what I assumed was some kind of angel tear facial mask. It's going to be incredible, Miles. Everyone who matters will be there. Everyone who matters. Isabel, speak for everyone who can witness my greatness and validate my existence. The guest list, which arrived in a follow-up text, read like a greatest hits compilation of people I'd strongly prefer to avoid. Her father Gerald. Monica from accounting, who laughed at every Isabel utterance like she was auditioning for a sitcom laugh track. Trevor from marketing, perpetual clapper. Bryce from sales, with his leased BMW and his need for everyone to know about it. Plus a handful of other coworkers whose names I could never hold on to because they all had the same personality, aggressively mediocre with delusions of grandeur. Do I have to go? I asked, already knowing the answer but feeling obligated to at least attempt escape. Isabel appeared from the bedroom, face covered in something green that made her look like she was auditioning for a swamp creature role. Of course you have to go. You're my husband. What would people think if you skipped it? Wouldn't want people thinking things, I said. Exactly. She completely missed my sarcasm, which was honestly our entire marriage summarized. And Miles, please try to actually engage tonight. Be supportive. Look interested in what people say, even if you're not. So basically, lie with my face. It's called being sociable, babe. You should try it sometime. The week leading up to dinner felt like watching someone plan their own coronation. Isabel spent hours agonizing over outfits, cycling through at least 15 dresses and soliciting my opinion on each one, then ignoring everything I said and picking something else entirely. She called the restaurant multiple times to confirm, adjust, and add people to the reservation. This is a really big deal, Miles, she said on Friday night, lying in bed scrolling her phone through what I assumed were articles on how to become even more insufferable. Top salesperson isn't just a title. It's a declaration. It says I'm the best. People respect that. People respect plenty of things, I replied, staring at the ceiling and contemplating what my life had become. Humility, for instance. That tends to go over pretty well. Humility is for people who don't have anything worth showcasing, she said, completely earnestly. When you've reached my level, people expect confidence. They want to see that you know your own value. I turned to look at her, this woman I'd married 3 years ago who had somehow transformed from someone I thought I loved into a walking LinkedIn profile. And what exactly is your value? More than most people, she answered without even a beat of hesitation. That's what tomorrow is about, Miles. Showing everyone that I've arrived. That I'm someone who counts. Saturday arrived with all the charm of an overdue dentist appointment. I spent the morning working out, not because I'm obsessive about fitness, but because hitting a heavy bag provides a kind of catharsis when you can't actually hit people. Then I showered, shaved, and pulled out the Tom Ford suit Isabel had insisted I buy for occasions of significance. $1,200 for glorified fabric. Highway robbery with better tailoring. Getting ready felt like suiting up for battle. I fixed my tie, stared at my reflection, and wondered when exactly my life had become an elaborate performance. Isabel emerged from her 2-hour preparation process looking like she was heading to a red carpet premiere. Hair immaculate, makeup flawless, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly expenses. How do I look? She asked, doing a slow spin. Like someone who plans to make tonight entirely about herself, I said, honestly. She beamed like I just handed her the world's greatest compliment. Perfect. That's exactly the vibe I'm going for. The drive to Redwood Steakhouse was a masterclass in patience. Isabel spent all 20 minutes of it briefing me like I was a junior staffer about to meet a head of state. Be supportive, Miles. Smile while people are speaking. Don't look bored. And please don't start talking about coding or whatever it is you do all day, nobody there wants to hear about that. So what should I talk about? I asked, navigating through traffic while she checked her makeup in the visor mirror for the 17th time. Just let me lead the conversation. You can nod and agree. That's what supportive husband looks like. So I'm a prop. You're my partner, she corrected, though it landed exactly like she meant prop. Tonight is my night, Miles. Everything tonight is about celebrating what I've accomplished, and I need you to be on board with that. I was entirely on board, actually. More than she knew. In fact, I was counting on everyone's full attention being locked onto Isabel, because what I had planned was going to hit so much harder in front of her entire fan club. We pulled into the restaurant parking lot. A few familiar cars were already there, Gerald's Mercedes, Monica's Lexus, Trevor's Prius, which he'd convinced himself was making a meaningful contribution to the environment. Remember, Isabel said as we climbed out, smoothing her dress down one more time. Supportive. Engaged. The husband I need you to be tonight. Don't worry, I said, offering her my arm as we walked toward the entrance. I'm going to be exactly the husband you deserve. She smiled, completely missing the gap between what she needed and what she deserved. The table at Redwood Steakhouse looked like it had been designed by someone who considered more is more to be a sacred design principle. Wine glasses multiplied across each place setting at a rate that suggested either professional sommelier or functional alcoholics. Candles flickered dramatically. Floral centerpieces that cost more than my first car sat in the middle of everything. Gerald occupied the head of the table, naturally, because in his mind, every table was his table, every room was his stage, every conversation was a platform. Never mind that said stage had been hours from foreclosure before I quietly saved it. Monica had positioned herself directly beside Isabel, ready to perform laughter on cue like a trained seal. Trevor was 3 drinks ahead of the rest of us. Bryce was loudly narrating the specs on his BMW to anyone who failed to make eye contact fast enough. And there I was. $1,200 suit, glass of champagne that tasted like fermented regret, watching this entire circus with the calm of a man who knew exactly how the night was going to end. Dinner started off exactly as predicted. Appetizers arrived, tiny architectural arrangements of food on plates the size of frisbees, the kind of pretentious cuisine where you genuinely need to search for what you're supposed to eat. This is absolutely divine, Monica declared, holding up something that might have been bread or possibly a section of drywall. Isabel, your taste in restaurants is honestly a gift. I know, Isabel replied, not even attempting to fake humility. I always know the right places. It's just something I have. Gerald launched into a story about the first time he'd eaten at Redwood Steakhouse, framed naturally around some deal he'd closed and the cigars that cost more than most people's grocery bills. The whole table listened with their best impression of genuine interest. I focused on my food and quietly ran a mental countdown. The thing about patience is that it's simultaneously a virtue and its own particular kind of suffering. I'd been patient for years. Patient through the belittling. Patient through Gerald treating me like sentient furniture. Patient through an entire company assuming I was some kind of unemployed hanger-on riding his wife's coattails. Tonight, that patience was finally going to pay out some dividends. Literally. The main course arrived with the ceremony of a royal birth. Waiters materialized like synchronized swimmers, placing enormous steaks before each of us with the gravity of priests distributing communion. Mine was perfect, medium rare, seasoned exactly right, from what was clearly a very pampered cow. I would never say this out loud, but it was genuinely excellent. Now this, Gerald announced, carving into his steak with the confidence of a man who'd never been denied anything, this is what success tastes like. Speaking of success, Isabel said, visibly coiling up for an extended monologue about herself. I wanted to thank everyone for showing up tonight. This award genuinely means everything to me. Top salesperson isn't just a label, it's validation. It's proof that hard work and raw talent actually pay off. Trevor started clapping. Monica joined in. Within seconds the entire table was applauding like Isabel had announced a cure for a major disease rather than hitting a sales quota. I couldn't have done this without my incredible team, she continued, sweeping her gaze around the table like a politician working a fundraiser. And of course my family. She looked at Gerald with actual warmth, then pivoted to me with something closer to obligation. And my husband Miles, who's been so supportive in his own way. In his own way. Translation, he lives in the same house and I occasionally remember he exists. Bryce, who'd been suspiciously quiet for the past 10 minutes, decided this was his moment. Isabel, Honestly, you're an inspiration. The way you closed the Henderson account, that was masterclass level. Some of us have been in sales for years and never pulled off anything that clean. It's all about reading the room, Isabel explained, warming immediately to her favorite subject, herself. Understanding what someone needs before they've even named it. It's practically instinct for me now. The conversation devolved into what was essentially a corporate worship service, with Isabel as the deity and everyone else as devoted congregation. They analyzed her techniques, her instincts, her supernatural gift for closing, like she'd emerged from the womb preloaded with sales skills. I tuned most of it out, concentrating on my steak and the countdown I'd been running since we sat down. Dessert was coming. After dessert, the toast. And after the toast, that's where everything was going to change. Right on cue, dessert landed, some elaborate chocolate creation that probably violated several laws of physics with how rich it was. Isabel barely touched hers, too busy holding court and receiving tributes. Then came the champagne, real champagne this time. Bottles of Dom Perignon that the restaurant had probably marked up 300%. Gerald insisted on opening the first bottle himself, making a whole production of it like he was christening an ocean liner. Glasses were filled. Isabel stood up, face flushed and radiant with wine and self-satisfaction, looking like someone who'd just conquered a small nation and had prepared a speech about it. "I want to make a toast," she announced, and the table fell silent immediately. "To strong women who lift men up by showing them exactly how it's done." The table erupted. Gerald nearly snorted champagne through his nose. Monica was laughing hard enough to produce actual tears. Trevor clapped and laughed simultaneously, which is physically impressive and deeply irritating. Then Isabel turned to me, and I could see it in her eyes, that little flicker of gleeful cruelty that people get right before they publicly humiliate someone and convince themselves it's harmless fun. "So, Miles," she said, her voice carrying across not just our table but probably to the kitchen. "Tell us all, what's it actually feel like, watching me succeed while you sit home doing absolutely nothing?" The laughter doubled. Bryce was practically gasping. Monica looked like she was at risk of a medical event. Gerald shook his head with a grin that said, "Isn't my daughter wonderfully bold?" "Don't be upset, I'm just teasing," Isabel added, reaching over to touch my arm. As if a quick disclaimer erased the thing she'd just done. As if just kidding is some kind of magic undo button for public humiliation. The table leaned in. They were expecting me to laugh it off, maybe make some self-deprecating quip about being a kept man, play my assigned role in the narrative where Isabel was the star and I was just lucky to be in the same orbit. Instead, I smiled. Not a forced smile, not a polite one, a real one, the kind that should have been a warning to everyone watching that something was very, very wrong. "Teasing is fun," I said, completely calm, my voice steady while my chest was basically doing cartwheels. "Want to hear mine?" Isabel's smile slipped just a fraction, but she nodded, probably expecting some harmless joke about her shoe collection or her obsession with sales rankings. I reached into my jacket and pulled out an envelope. Thick, heavy paper, the kind law firms use when they want you to understand that the contents are serious. I slid it across the table toward Isabel, watching her face shift from confused to uncertain as she picked it up. "What is this?" she asked, smile still holding but gone wobbly at the edges. "Open it," I said, taking a sip of champagne. Might as well enjoy the good stuff while reshaping someone's entire reality. She pulled out the documents inside, and I watched her face run through about 15 different emotional states in under 5 seconds. Confusion. Disbelief. Shock. Horror. And finally landing somewhere that looked like her soul was trying to evacuate through her eye sockets. "I own 77% of Kinton Holdings," I said, conversationally, the way you'd comment on the weather or mention that you like the bread. "Which means I own this company." "Your company. Your father's company. And effective immediately, Isabel Kinton, you're fired." You could have heard a pin drop in space. The silence was so complete, so total, that even the candles seemed to stop moving. Every face at the table had locked into some version of shock. Mouths hanging open. Eyes wide. Champagne glasses frozen halfway to lips. Monica looked like someone had just informed her that Santa wasn't real. Trevor had finally, mercifully, stopped clapping. Bryce's signature smirk had melted clean off his face like wax on a hot plate. And Gerald looked like he was watching his entire world come apart in slow motion. But Isabel's face, that was the masterpiece. That was 3 years of condescension, 3 years of being made to feel like nothing, 3 years of having my existence treated like a punchline, all of it crashing down in one perfect wave of realization. "You," she started, but nothing followed. I stood up, straightened my $1,200 suit, and smiled at the table. "Thanks for dinner, everyone." The steak was genuinely exceptional. 5 stars. Highly recommend. The thing about detonating a bomb in the middle of a fine dining establishment is that the shockwave takes a second to arrive. For about 3 full seconds after I announced my ownership and Isabel's termination, nobody moved. It was like someone had hit pause on reality, everyone frozen in this stunning tableau of collective disbelief. Then reality unpaused and everything fell apart at once. Isabel's jaw dropped so far I was genuinely concerned about her jaw alignment. Her face cycled through colors like a malfunctioning traffic signal. Red, white, purple, back to red. The documents were still trembling in her hands, and she was staring at them like they were written in ancient script rather than plain legal English. She stammered, and I'd never heard her stammer before. Isabel was always sharp, always loaded with a comeback or a cutting observation. Watching her struggle to form a sentence was like watching a veteran actor blank on opening night. You can't. This isn't. What the hell is this? Gerald snatched the papers out of her hands with enough force to nearly tear them. His face had shifted from its normal ruddy tone to something approaching eggplant, which probably wasn't doing him any cardiovascular favors. He flipped through page after page of legal documentation, the kind Patricia Thornton had prepared with the thoroughness that justified her hourly rate, as if reading faster would somehow change what was written. This is impossible, he muttered, cycling through the pages again. Miles, you can't just, we had an agreement. We did have an agreement, I confirmed, still standing, because sitting down would have ruined the exit energy. An agreement where I purchased 77% of your company in exchange for pulling it back from the edge of bankruptcy. Remember that Tuesday in 2017 in your office? You were sweating through a suit worth more than most people make in a month. Monica had both hands over her mouth, as if physically holding in a scream. Trevor had stopped clapping, probably a personal record, and was staring at me like I'd just revealed I was an extraterrestrial observing human behavior. Bryce kept switching his gaze between his phone and the documents in Gerald's hands, visibly calculating whether this affected his BMW lease. But you said, Isabel's voice cracked, and for the first time since I'd known her, she sounded genuinely fragile rather than strategically emotional. You told me you were doing freelance coding. You said you were working on small projects. I was working on a project, I replied, savoring every syllable more than I'd savored anything in recent memory. A pretty significant one, actually. It was called secretly owning the company my wife works for while she spends 3 years treating me like an unemployed loser. Very fulfilling work. Deeply satisfying on a personal level. Miles, you cannot fire my daughter. Gerald shot to his feet so fast his chair tipped backward and crashed to the floor with a bang loud enough to turn every head in the restaurant. We were officially that table now, the live dinner theater everyone else was watching over their overpriced steaks. This is absurd. This is. Patricia signed off on all of this, I said. Patricia did more than sign off, she structured the whole thing. Remarkable woman. You should give her a raise. Oh, I suppose that's actually my call now, isn't it? A waiter approached with the nervous energy of someone trying to decide between calling security and letting this play out organically. Is everything all right over here? Everything is completely fine, I assured him. Just a small family conversation about corporate ownership and employment restructuring. Nothing to worry about. Though I will need a box for the rest of my steak. And definitely the creme brulee, not leaving that behind. He nodded and retreated at a pace that suggested survival instinct was kicking in. Smart man. You absolute bastard, Isabel hissed, and the tears coming now were real ones, not the on-demand kind she could summon for effect, but actual, raw tears. You've been lying to me for years. What kind of person does that? The kind whose wife turns every dinner into a performance about her own greatness while asking what it feels like watching her succeed while he does nothing, I replied. That kind. The kind who gets introduced at every company event as my husband who does tech stuff, like he's some embarrassing hobby you can't quite figure out how to get rid of. Monica finally found her voice. This is insane. Miles, nobody is going to believe you've been running this company all along. I haven't been running it, I clarified. Gerald's been running it, doing a mediocre job, by the way. I've just been owning it. There's a real difference. Though now that I'm thinking about it, some operational changes might be overdue. Starting with a full restructuring of the sales department. Trevor made a noise like a small distressed animal. Bryce had gone the color of uncooked dough, probably realizing his BMW bragging rights might have an expiration date if I decided to clean house. Daddy, do something, Isabel pleaded, turning to Gerald with desperation written across her face. But Gerald wasn't looking at his daughter. He was looking at me with an expression that combined fury, humiliation, and something that was grudgingly close to respect. You planned all of this, he said slowly. The whole thing. You've been planning this for years. Planning is a strong word, I said. I prefer patiently waiting for exactly the right moment, and by the way, thank you, Isabel, for delivering it so perfectly tonight. That little toast about watching you succeed while I do nothing? Chef's kiss. Couldn't have written it better if I'd tried. I'll sue you, Isabel threatened, though her voice had lost its conviction. I'll take you for everything. Divorce, litigation, I will destroy you. With what resources? I asked, reasonably. You just got terminated. And our prenup, the one you insisted on, by the way, because you were so concerned I'd try to claim your family's wealth, does a very thorough job of protecting my assets. Patricia reviewed it. Airtight. Great work, truly. The color drained from Isabel's face as the memory of that prenup settled in, the one she'd presented with such smugness before the wedding, protecting her family fortune from her underachieving husband. The irony was so stunning it deserved to be framed and hung on a wall. This is corporate aggression, Gerald blustered, though he deflated considerably. I'll call an emergency board meeting. We'll challenge this. You can't just walk in and. The board answers to the majority shareholder, I interrupted. That's me. I basically am the board at this point. Or at minimum, I control enough votes that your emergency meeting would be very short and very disappointing. I picked up my champagne glass, drained it, and set it down with a satisfying ring against the table. Now, if everyone will excuse me, I have a lovely evening ahead. The city's beautiful this time of night. Maybe I'll walk a bit, enjoy the fresh air and my newly activated corporate authority, think about which other employees have spent the last few years being insufferable. Miles, wait. Isabel stood up and reached for my arm. For just a second, one brief second, I almost felt something. Almost. Then I remembered every cutting remark, every dismissive introduction, every time she'd made herself bigger by making me smaller. Don't touch me, I said quietly, stepping back. You wanted to know what it feels like watching someone succeed. Now you get to find out what it feels like watching your world unravel. Sit with that. I hear it builds character. I turned and walked toward the exit, leaving behind a table of people whose entire map of reality had just been redrawn. The waiter appeared near the door with a bag containing my leftover steak and creme brulee. Bless him entirely. I took it, pressed $100 bill into his hand, because none of this was his fault and he'd just witnessed the most uncomfortably eventful shift of his serving career, and walked out into the night. The cool air hit me like grace. Behind me, through the restaurant windows, I could see our table in full meltdown. Isabel crying, Gerald yelling, Monica looking like she might actually faint, Trevor probably reconsidering whether clapping would help. My phone started buzzing before I reached the car. Isabel calling, declined. Gerald calling, declined. Unknown number, declined. By the time I got home, there were 20 missed calls and a voicemail from Isabel that was split evenly between sobbing and fury. I listened to it while eating my leftover steak, which somehow tasted even better cold with the sound of consequences finally catching up to 3 years of being treated like garbage. You're a monster, her voice came through the phone, thick and broken. How could you do this to me? To us? Everything I built, everything I worked for. I deleted it before she finished. Everything she'd built had been constructed on a foundation I'd paid for with money she didn't know I had, while she spent every day reminding me how little I'd accomplished. The creme brulee was outstanding, by the way. 5 stars. Would absolutely recommend. Waking up the morning after you've publicly humiliated your wife and strategically demolished her entire professional identity probably should have felt worse than it did. Maybe I was supposed to be lying awake in a spiral of guilt and regret. Instead, I woke up feeling like I'd just slept for 12 straight hours in the best hotel bed of my life, which probably says something unflattering about my character. But I was at peace with that. The first signal that my life had fundamentally shifted came when I opened my front door to get the newspaper. Yes, I still get an actual physical newspaper, because apparently I am emotionally 80 years old, and found a man with a camera standing on my lawn like that was a perfectly reasonable place to be at 7 in the morning. Mr. Brooks, he called out, raising his camera like he was documenting a celebrity sighting rather than photographing a guy in pajama pants and a college t-shirt that had survived better eras. Can you comment on your hostile takeover of Kenton Holdings? Hostile takeover? I called back, squinting into the morning sun. It wasn't hostile at all. I smiled throughout the entire thing. That's actually the opposite of hostile. He kept shooting. Through the window I could see there were now 3 photographers, plus a woman with a microphone who'd materialized from somewhere. They were camped out like paparazzi outside a celebrity scandal, which, technically, this was. My phone had detonated overnight. Text messages from numbers I'd never seen. Emails from business journalists. LinkedIn requests from people who presumably wanted to write pieces about the silent shareholder, which was, apparently, what the business media had started calling me. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and looked up what the internet had decided about my life. The first article I found was on a tech business blog. The headline, Silent Shareholder Reveals Majority Stake in Stunning Dinner Revelation. Stunning dinner revelation. Written like I'd announced the coming of a messiah rather than just firing my wife in front of her father and coworkers. The article itself was entertaining, though. Some journalist had gotten the story from someone at the dinner, probably within minutes of me walking out, and had written this breathless piece about corporate intrigue and hidden ownership structures. I made the mistake of scrolling the comments section, as one does. This is the most unhinged thing I've ever read. Imagine getting roasted by your own wife and then casually firing her in front of everyone. This person is a legend. Someone call Netflix. This is a series. By mid-morning the articles had multiplied. Who is Miles Brooks? The man behind Kinton Holdings. From silent partner to majority shareholder, an unlikely story. The best part was watching Isabel try to control the narrative. She'd posted on LinkedIn, of course she had, something that was equal parts damage control and creative revisionism. Recent developments in my family life have led to some unexpected shifts in my professional path, she'd written. While I'm no longer with Kinton Holdings, I'm excited to explore what comes next. Sometimes change, even when it's hard, opens doors we didn't know were there. 300 comments, mostly variations of what happened? And are you okay? With a handful of sharper ones like karma really does move in mysterious ways. She was framing getting fired by her secretly wealthy husband as some kind of empowering career pivot, which was honestly impressive in its audacity. My phone rang. Patricia Thornton. You've made quite a spectacle, she said, the amusement audible underneath the professional tone. There are reporters outside my office asking about the acquisition structure. My assistant has had to learn 17 variations of no comment in a single morning. My apologies for that, I said, not particularly sorry at all. Probably should have warned you about the timing. The timing was actually perfect. Brutal, but perfect. She paused. I assume you're already thinking about restructuring. How did you know? Because you're not the kind of person who fires his wife in a restaurant just for the drama of it. You have a plan. What is it? I liked Patricia. Sharp, efficient, no time wasted pretending business was anything other than chess with better clothes. I want a clean operation, I told her. Starting with a new CEO, someone who actually knows how to run a company instead of playing golf and betting on artisanal air startups. Do you have someone specific in mind? Tara Lane. A pause. Tara Lane from Meridian Solutions? The one who restructured an entire department before her first lunch break? That's exactly the one. Relentless, efficient, and genuinely allergic to incompetence. Exactly what this company needs. She'll cost you, Patricia warned. Her terms are going to be significant. I own 77% of a multi-million-dollar company, I said. I think I can cover significant. By noon, the photographers outside had grown to 6, plus 2 news vans. I ordered Thai food delivery just to watch them get excited when the car pulled up, then visibly deflate when it turned out to be pad Thai. The restructuring moved fast. Tara Lane agreed to a video call that afternoon. She appeared on my screen looking exactly like her reputation suggested, sharp blazer, sharper expression, hair pulled back in a way that communicated pure business. Mr. Brooks, she said, with zero preamble. I've been reading about you all morning. Interesting story. Yeah, it's been a strange 24 hours, I admitted. I don't do strange, she said flatly. I do outcomes. Your company is a disaster. Bloated departments, redundant roles, a culture that hasn't evolved since the late 80s. If I take this job, I'm tearing out everything that doesn't work and starting over. Are you ready for that? That's precisely what I'm asking for. She smiled for the first time. It was a little bit terrifying. Then we have a deal. Send the contracts. I'll be there Monday. Gerald tried to call an emergency board meeting, exactly as I'd predicted. It lasted about 15 minutes before the board, most of whom were smart enough to understand which way things were moving, voted in favor of every change I proposed. New CEO, full departmental restructuring, compensation structures that rewarded actual performance instead of golf handicaps and tenure. Within a week, Kinton Holdings looked nothing like it had before. Tara Lane had arrived like a weather event and immediately started correcting things that should have been fixed years ago. The old hierarchy that had rewarded yes men and quietly strangled anyone with an original idea was being broken down piece by piece. And Isabel? She spent the week posting inspirational quotes on social media about resilience and fresh starts. Finding myself, She captioned one photo at a coffee shop, laptop open, like she was deep in meaningful work rather than scrolling job boards and crying into her latte. I sent her exactly one text. The first communication since the dinner. Google Maps might actually help with the finding yourself part. Apparently they're very good at locating lost things. She didn't reply. But I like to think she found it useful. A week after the media circus began its slow fade into the background, replaced by some celebrity drama and a viral video of a cat doing something irresistible, I was finally starting to enjoy the quiet of my new normal. It was a Tuesday evening. I was on my couch in sweatpants eating leftover Chinese food straight from the container like a functioning adult, when someone started hammering on my front door. Not knocking, hammering. The kind of relentless pounding that meant either a genuine emergency or someone who had forgotten doorbells existed. The hammering continued, and curiosity outlasted my desire to finish my Kung Pao chicken in peace. I opened the door, and there stood Isabel. Except this wasn't the polished, camera-ready Isabel who'd spent 3 years of our marriage looking like she'd walked out of a business lifestyle magazine. This was Isabel at her most unguarded. Mascara streaked down both cheeks. Hair shoved into a forgotten ponytail. Wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt that I was fairly certain used to be mine. "Miles," she said, and her voice fractured immediately. Not the strategic crack she deployed when she wanted something, but a genuine break, the kind that comes from crying for roughly 17 hours straight. "Isabel," I replied, still holding my Chinese food. "You look terrible. Can I come in?" She dragged her sleeve across her face, making the mascara situation considerably worse. Every rational instinct I had said close the door, go back to the Kung Pao chicken, and watch the submarine documentary you paused. But there was something different about her. Something that made her seem less like the woman who'd spent years diminishing me and more like an actual human being moving through something genuinely painful. "Fine," I said, stepping aside. "But if you touch my Chinese food, we're done talking." She walked in slowly, taking in the apartment like she was seeing it properly for the first time. "I made a mistake," she said, standing in the middle of my living room like she wasn't sure she had permission to sit. "Which one?" I asked, settling back onto the couch with my food. "There have been several recently." "Be specific." "Mocking you at the dinner. In front of everyone." She crossed her arms around herself. "I didn't know, Miles. I genuinely had no idea you own the company. If I had known." "You would have what?" I set the food down, suddenly not hungry. "Been nicer? Shown me some respect?" "That's the problem, Isabel. You would only have treated me differently if you'd known I had power. That's not respect. That's just self-preservation." She flinched like I'd physically struck her, and the tears came again. Real ones. "You're right," she whispered. "You're completely right. I was cruel to you. For years, I made you feel like you were nothing. Less than nothing," I said. "You treated me like a burden you were stuck carrying while you went off and achieved greatness. Like I was dead weight you kept around out of some vague sense of obligation." "I know." She finally sat down, collapsing into the chair across from me like her legs had given out. "My father called you furniture once. At that 4th of July barbecue. Said you were like a nice ottoman, present but not particularly useful." And I laughed. I remembered. I'd been standing right there with a plate of potato salad, pretending I hadn't heard it, while Gerald and Isabel had their little bonding moment at my expense. "That's what pride does," I said, leaning back into the cushions. "It makes you loud and blind. Like karaoke at a funeral. You were so consumed with performing your own success, proving to every room how remarkable you were, that you never stopped to notice who you were stepping on to get there." "I'm sorry," she said. And for once in our entire shared history, it rang true. "I know that doesn't fix it. I know I destroyed what we had. But I needed you to know that I see it now. I see what I did. What I turned into." We sat in silence for a moment. The submarine documentary was still murmuring in the background, something about torpedo engineering that felt wildly out of place for this particular conversation. "Are you asking for forgiveness?" I said finally. She looked up at me, mascara streaked and unguarded in a way I'd genuinely never seen. "I don't know if I've earned it." "You probably haven't," I agreed. "But that's not really the question. The question is whether I'm in a place to give it. Are you?" I smiled, not the triumphant one from the restaurant, not the satisfied one I'd worn all week. Just a tired one. "Maybe someday, Isabel. But right now I'm busy doing nothing." She laughed through her tears, soft and weak, but real. And for the first time in our entire relationship, it sounded like it actually came from somewhere genuine. 6 months later, I was standing in a ballroom that probably ran more per night than most people earned in a year, wearing a tuxedo that actually fit this time, No, thanks to Isabel's fashion input, watching Kinton Holdings' transformation play out in real time, like some kind of corporate glow-up story. The charity gala was Tara Lane's idea. Community engagement, she'd called it, corporate shorthand for let's throw an expensive party, invite wealthy people, and talk them into donating money to good causes while they eat overpriced food. And honestly, it was working. The event had raised over $2 million for local education programs, and nobody had needed to be threatened to make it happen. The company itself had undergone a transformation that would make a butterfly look underambitious. Tara had gutted every toxic corner, replaced the old guard with people who actually knew their jobs, and installed a merit-based system that rewarded results instead of political maneuvering. Profits were up 23%. Employee morale had gone through the roof. Gerald still held his 23% and still showed up to board meetings to grumble about newfangled approaches like he was some kind of fossilized executive. But his objections carried about as much weight as a protest sign made of wet tissue paper. The board had seen the numbers, recognized that Tara's leadership was working, and essentially told Gerald to sit down and cash his dividend checks. Isabel had landed somewhere. She'd taken a position at a competing firm and was doing reasonably well by all accounts. Through the grapevine, and by grapevine I mean LinkedIn, which is entirely normal and not even slightly strange, word had gotten around that she'd become noticeably less insufferable. Apparently public humiliation and professional catastrophe had a way of teaching humility that nothing else quite managed. Character development through disaster. Beautiful thing. We'd signed divorce papers 3 months prior. It had been surprisingly civil, largely because the prenup she'd insisted on made the whole thing clean and uncomplicated. She kept her dignity, whatever remained of it. I kept essentially everything else. Patricia had described it as the smoothest divorce settlement I've ever processed, which felt like the kind of achievement worth noting. I was nursing a glass of scotch, the good kind, not the kind that tastes like a regret inferno, when a young woman approached. Couldn't have been older than 25, wearing a black dress and an intern badge that identified her as Jessica Chun, marketing. Mr. Brooks, she said, carrying the nervous energy of someone who'd psyched themselves up for this conversation and was now fully committed to seeing it through. I'm so sorry to bother you, but I just needed to say thank you. Thank me? I raised an eyebrow. For what? I haven't actually done anything. She laughed like I'd made a joke. That's not what everyone here says. Since the transition and since Miss Lane came in, the whole culture has shifted. People actually want to come to work. There are mentorship programs, real training, genuine development paths, and nobody's getting promoted just because they have the right golf buddy. That's all Tara, I said, honestly. She's the one doing the hard work. I just write checks and show up to events in uncomfortable shoes. But everyone talks about how you turn the whole thing around, Jessica pressed, eyes bright with the kind of earnest admiration that corporate life hasn't quite beaten out of her yet. About how you saw what needed to change and actually made it happen. What's your secret? I took a slow sip of scotch and thought about it. Around us, the gala hummed along, people laughing, networking, performing their roles in this elaborate theater of wealth and generosity. A string quartet floated something classical from the corner. You want the real secret? I said, leaning in just slightly like I was about to reveal something cosmic. Stay quiet long enough that everyone underestimates you. She looked confused, like she'd been hoping for some distilled wisdom about disruption and synergy. Not literally nothing, I clarified. But people mix up noise with productivity. They think if you're not constantly broadcasting your achievements and making sure everyone knows how buried you are in important work, then you must not be doing anything. Meanwhile, the people actually getting things done are working quietly, building their position, waiting for exactly the right moment. Jessica nodded slowly, turning it over. So it's really about patience. Patience, and letting people reveal who they actually are, I said. When you're underestimated, people stop performing for you. The mask comes down. You see exactly who they are, who deserves your trust, and who deserves to be fired in front of their entire social circle at an overpriced steakhouse. She laughed again, probably assuming I was being metaphorical. I was not. She drifted off to network, leaving me alone with my scotch and the view through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights spread out like a constellation of possibilities. Somewhere out there, Isabel was at her own company event, performing her rebuilt role as the reformed professional who'd learned something hard about humility. Gerald was probably home, privately seething about how his son-in-law had outplayed him at every turn. Monica and Trevor were somewhere, still clapping and laughing on cue for whoever came next. And I was here. Not the invisible husband anymore. Not the underestimated +1. Not the guy who supposedly did nothing while his wife conquered the corporate world. I was the majority shareholder. The one who'd played the longest game and walked away with everything. When I stepped out of that gala into the cool night air, The city felt different. Lighter, somehow, like I'd finally stepped out from behind someone else's shadow and into my own. They'd laughed at me for doing nothing. Dismissed me. Treated me like furniture that needed feeding. Now they work for the guy who does it best. And honestly, that felt pretty damn good. Story 4. My wife said where she went wasn't my business. Then at 2 a.m. her calls started flooding in. Emergency. Please answer. I'm scared. I read every text. Watched every call ring. Did nothing. She came home at 6 a.m., mascara streaked, heel broken. Found me eating breakfast. Why weren't you there? I took a sip of coffee. Your problems aren't my concern either. She told me her plans were none of my concern, said it right to my face before slipping out for yet another secret getaway with her wealthy boss. Then at 2:17 in the morning, my phone started lighting up with her calls, 18 of them back to back. I watched every single one go to voicemail. I read every frantic text she sent, every desperate plea for help, and I didn't lift a finger. That was the moment I made my decision. Mercy, forgiveness, being the stand-up guy, none of that was my concern anymore either. My name is Alex Carter, and what follows is the story of how I took apart two people's lives with the same cold precision I used to put up steel frames for skyscrapers. The slow-burning kind of rage, that's the one you have to watch out for. Not the kind that explodes in a flash and burns itself out. The calculating kind. The kind that doesn't react, it plans. That's exactly what was running through me the day I came home early from a month-long job out in Wyoming, flowers in hand, thinking I'd surprise Megan and maybe finally have that conversation about kids. What happened instead was I got the surprise of my life, and it wasn't anything close to good. I pulled my truck into the garage and just sat there for a second, and everything felt exactly right. The house we'd built together, the lawn we kept perfect, the beautiful suburban life we'd created in one of Denver's best neighborhoods. I grabbed my bag from the seat, already picturing the look on her face when she saw me. 7 years of marriage, and even with the distance my work sometimes created, I was sure about us. Rock solid. The kind of couple other people looked at with envy. I was dead wrong. The front door was already unlocked, which should have set off every alarm in my head. Megan obsessed over security. She checked the locks twice every night and had talked me into installing a $1,500 alarm system just the previous year because she said she felt vulnerable when I was away. Now I understood what she really needed it for, easy disabling. As I stepped into the entryway, my boots making no sound on the hardwood I'd laid myself, I heard something that stopped my blood cold. Laughter. Her laughter, but not the kind she ever used around me anymore. This was a different sound entirely. Unguarded, intimate, the sound of two people sharing a secret that had no business being shared. I stood right there in my own hallway, invisible inside my own home, while my wife casually mapped out her betrayal without a hint of shame. The other voice was smooth and self-assured, the kind of voice that comes from spending a lifetime getting exactly what it wants and never being challenged. They were in the living room, probably on the couch I'd hauled up 3 flights of stairs and assembled with my own hands, drinking wine my paychecks had bought, with time they'd stolen from me. Next Friday is perfect, Megan was saying, her voice carrying that warm, flirtatious energy I remembered from when we first started dating, the way she used to sound when she looked at me. Alex will be in Seattle at least 2 weeks, maybe longer if the project drags on like they always do. We can have the whole weekend at Silver Peak. I'll tell him it's some kind of client crisis that needs me there immediately. He'll buy it. He always does. The man laughed, a low, greedy sound. The kind of laugh that belongs to someone who takes whatever he wants and never pays the price. You're getting real good at this, Meg. Makes me wonder what else you've been keeping hidden. What other stories you've got polished to perfection. Don't even worry about it, Daniel, she said softly. I could hear the smile behind her words. Could see in my mind the way she'd be leaning into him, touching his arm the way she once touched mine. You're my only secret. My most thrilling, most expensive secret. My way out of the dull little life I've been living. They laughed together after that, and something inside me split open. Not shattered, cracked. Like a dam that's holding on by a thread, pressure building behind it, force accumulating, waiting for the moment when it finally gives way and takes everything downstream with it. I could have walked in right then. Could have confronted them, started screaming, thrown punches, become every cliché of the betrayed husband falling apart in his own living room. But I didn't. Because standing there in the shadows of my own home with my bag still clenched in both hands, I remembered something true about myself that years of playing the devoted husband had buried. I was a builder, yes, but I also knew how to tear things down. I'd demolish structures before raising better ones in their place. That's what this moment called for. Demolition first. I backed out of that house one careful step at a time, the military muscle memory from years ago taking over without me asking it to. Got back into my truck. Drove with perfectly steady hands to the Red Canyon bar, where I knew my buddy James River would be a few drinks in by now. James and I had served together in Afghanistan. He'd saved my life on 2 separate occasions and once done something darker on my behalf without ever needing an explanation. He was the one person who would understand what I was about to become. The bar was exactly what I needed, dim and smoky despite the ban, full of people who'd seen too much and given up pretending otherwise. James was in his corner booth with a bourbon, those sharp eyes catching me the second I came through the door. He clocked everything before I even sat down. "You look like somebody just shot your dog," he said as I slid in across from him. "Except you don't own a dog." "So what happened?" I couldn't find the words right away. They were stuck somewhere between my chest and my throat like broken glass. Finally I got them out. "Megan is sleeping with her boss. They're in my house together right now. Probably in my bed." James didn't flinch or offer sympathy. He just nodded slowly, like he'd been bracing for this conversation for years. "How long have you known?" 20 minutes. Came home early. Heard them working out their next trip away. "And you walked out instead of putting him through the wall?" "Because I've got something better in mind," I said. And something in the way I said it made James smile. Not a warm smile. The smile of someone who recognizes their own kind. "I'm going to take them apart completely, financially, professionally, in every way that matters. I'm going to make them regret ever crossing paths with each other, ever crossing paths with me, ever waking up on the same planet I live on." James flagged the bartender for 2 more. "Tell me what you need." The following week was a masterclass in self-control that would have impressed my old drill sergeant. I played the part perfectly. Came home from the trip I'd supposedly been on, told a convincing story about delays and contractor issues. Kissed Megan on the cheek when she flinched just slightly at my touch. Noticed how she couldn't hold my eyes for more than a second. How her phone was always face down on every surface, always face down now. She was jumpy, constantly sneaking peeks at her screen with those quick, guilt-soaked glances that people think are subtle and never are. I watched her the way a scientist watches a specimen, noting every lie, every hollow smile, every mechanical laugh, every time she said she loved me while her phone buzzed with messages that lit her up in ways I hadn't seen in years. I never pushed. Never gave her the tears and accusations and big dramatic confrontation she'd probably imagined in her head. I was cold and methodical, quietly building a case she didn't even know was being built. James, using his military network and zero regard for legal niceties, ran professional surveillance. What came back made my stomach twist: photographs, timestamps exposing every lie she'd told, credit card receipts from hotel stays we'd never taken together. Daniel Hudson. 44 years old. CEO of Hudson Marketing Group. Married, 2 kids in private school, a net worth hovering around $40 million from what public records showed. My wife's boss. Pathetically, insultingly predictable. But here's what Megan had no clue about. What no one knew except my accountant Gerald and my attorney Lisa. 2 years back, right around the time Megan started pulling away, when the warmth left her eyes and our conversations turned into transactions, I'd started protecting myself. Not a conscious decision at first, just instinct. An animal sense that winter was coming and I needed to prepare. 15 years in construction and engineering had given me connections across 3 states, a reputation for finishing big jobs early and under budget, and skills that were always in demand. So I quietly built my own company, Carter Steel Solutions, structured through enough corporate layers that even a forensic accountant with a law degree would need a week and a flashlight to map it out. Custom metal fabrication for commercial construction, precision work that commanded premium rates. And business had exploded. $30 million in contracts already lined up, profits reinvesting faster than I could plan for. All completely invisible to Megan. She still thought I was just Alex the contractor, making decent money but nothing that would make her stay. She had no idea I was building an empire while she was building her lies. I spent hours behind my closed office door, supposedly working on estimates. What I was actually doing was documenting everything. Every dollar Megan spent. Every trip. Every emergency meeting that showed up as a hotel charge. James kept feeding me photos and recordings that made my hands shake, but I filed them away without blinking. Evidence. Ammunition. The bricks I'd used to knock down the life she thought was safe. I started catching details I'd chosen not to see before. The designer wardrobe that had appeared out of nowhere. The hours she spent getting ready for work versus the 30 seconds she gave me when she got home. The way she dropped Daniel's name into conversations constantly, like he was something special instead of a married man sneaking around on his own family. The obsessive mirror checking before she left each day, like she was performing for an audience that wasn't me. The tipping point came on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after I'd first heard them together. I sat in the living room pretending to look at my laptop while she got ready to go out. She'd become bold lately, almost daring me to say something. The outfit she had on was stunning, all designer labels, a dress I'd never seen before that probably cost someone's rent payment. Paid for with money from our joint account I'd been quietly routing into my hidden company accounts. The irony was not lost on me. "I'm going out," she announced, taking one last look in the hallway mirror and turning slowly to make sure every angle looked right. For him. Her tone was sharp, testing me, hoping I'd push back so she could start a fight and use it to justify whatever she was doing in her head. I looked up from my screen, face completely blank, giving her nothing. "Where to?" She wheeled around and there was something in her eyes, guilt mixed with defiance mixed with contempt. "Where I'm going is none of your business, none of your concern, not your problem. Honestly, you've been impossible lately. So cold and checked out and buried in your work. Maybe if you actually paid attention to your own wife instead of running off to every project that comes along, I wouldn't need to find my own entertainment." The nerve of it. The absolute, breathtaking audacity of someone who's been cheating on you then turning it around to make you the reason, making you feel responsible for pushing them away. It almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead I nodded once, keeping my face flat and unreadable. "You're right," I said, my voice completely level. "It's not my business. Have a good night, Megan. Don't bother waiting up." She hesitated, clearly expecting fireworks, needing the drama and the tears to justify herself. But when I turned back to my laptop without another word, dismissing her like she was already a ghost, she grabbed her bag and left. The door slammed hard enough to knock a picture frame sideways on the wall. I sat alone in our beautiful home, counting to 100, letting the fury roll through me and then past me, until it settled into something colder and far more useful. Rage was hot and sloppy. What I had now was ice. Clarity. Intent. Then I picked up my phone and texted James, "It's time. Get everything ready. We move tomorrow." His reply came back instantly, "Been waiting for this. Both targets. No mercy." At 2:30 in the morning my phone started buzzing on the nightstand, that vibration unbearably loud in the dead quiet of the house. Megan's name flashed on the screen once, twice, 3 times, 4. I watched it ring from where I lay on top of the covers, propped on my pillow, wide awake, staring at the ceiling. Counting each missed call like keeping score. I'd been expecting this. Daniel Hudson was a predator, but underneath that he was a coward, the type who takes what he wants right up until there's actual risk involved, and then vanishes. Something had gone sideways on their little getaway, and now she needed me. Now she wanted the man she'd been betraying to ride in and fix whatever mess she'd made, to play the dependable rescue plan she'd always kept in her back pocket. I let it ring. Let her panic. Let her feel what it was like to desperately need someone who simply wasn't there. After the 4th call, the text started. "Alex, please. I need you. Emergency. Please answer." Then, "I'm scared. Where are you?" Then, with typos that gave away how shaken she was, "Please don't do this. I'm sorry. Please." I read every single one as they came in. Felt nothing but a cold, quiet satisfaction settling deep in my chest. Whatever was happening to her out there, she'd earned every second of it. She'd made her choices. Now she was living inside them. I powered off my phone and went to sleep, the deepest, most peaceful sleep I'd had in months. She stumbled back in around 6 the next morning, just as daylight was starting to color the sky. Mascara tracked down her face in dark streaks, one of her expensive Louboutin heels snapped clean off and hanging at a broken angle, the red sole catching the light like something wounded. Her dress was torn at the shoulder. She looked like the night had chewed her up and spit her back out. And when she walked into the kitchen and found me calmly eating breakfast, something between relief and terror moved across her face. "Alex," she said, and her voice was raw from crying or screaming or both. "I called you over and over. Why didn't you pick up? Why weren't you there?" I looked at her over my coffee mug, took my time, let the silence do its work, took a slow sip before answering. "The coffee was excellent. You made it pretty clear that where you were going was none of my business. So I figured where you were when you needed help wasn't my business either." Seemed consistent. I paused, watching it land. "Tough night? You don't look great." Her face ran through a whole cycle of emotions before landing on barely leashed fury. "You bastard. You absolute bastard. I could have been hurt. I could have been in real danger. Something terrible could have happened to me and you just sat there ignoring my calls. And yet here you are," I said calmly, another sip of coffee, the same tone you'd used to talk about the weather. Alive. Unharmed. Standing in our kitchen, having managed completely without my help. Funny how that worked out. Makes you wonder what else you've been managing without my knowing. She opened her mouth to go at me again, but I was already on my feet, grabbing my keys off the hook, walking past her without so much as a glance. I've got a meeting. Important one. Don't wait up. I paused at the door and looked back at her for just a moment. You might want a shower, Megan. You smell like someone else's cologne. The meeting was with Lisa Martin, the most feared divorce attorney in the state of Colorado. Her reputation arrived before her like a weather front. Her downtown office was all glass and chrome and hard angles, which suited her perfectly. When I sat down across from her and laid out everything I had, the documentation, the evidence James had gathered, all of it, she smiled. Not a warm smile. The smile of a shark that just picked up a scent. Alex, she said, leaning back in her chair and pressing her fingertips together, I've spent 20 years in family law. I've heard it all. Every betrayal, every story, every excuse. But what you've brought me today, she gestured at the spread of folders across her desk, this is extraordinary. A cheating spouse entangled in corporate fraud, a compromised executive with a trail of harassment settlements, and a client who actually had the foresight to document everything and protect his own assets. You're not just a victim here. You came prepared to fight. And I'm going to make sure you win. We worked through the afternoon and into the evening, ordering in food, going through every piece of evidence like military strategists, the secret company, the separate accounts, every cent Megan had spent and every trip she'd taken and every lie she'd told. James had done remarkable work, photos that made Lisa raise her eyebrows, recordings that pulled a low whistle from her, timestamp documentation that built an airtight case for systematic, deliberate betrayal. But Lisa always wanted more. That's what made her the best. This Daniel Hudson, she said, pulling up everything she could find on him, fingers moving fast across her keyboard. He's had complaints before. 3 harassment claims in 5 years, all buried under NDA agreements paid out of company funds. His books have some creative entries that I'm certain the SEC would find fascinating. If we can dig deep enough, if we can tie Megan directly to his financial crimes, we don't just end a marriage. We end 2 careers, 2 reputations, 2 lives. We don't just divorce them. We dismantle them. Perfect, I said, and my voice had no warmth in it whatsoever. That is exactly what I'm after. I want them to lose it all, the way they tried to take everything from me. This is going to get messy, Lisa said, looking at me seriously. Mutual friends will pick sides. People will have opinions. Your personal life becomes a public story. Are you truly ready for that? Because once we start, there's no pulling back. This is scorched earth, Alex. I thought about Megan's face the night she said my concerns weren't her problem. Thought about the 2 of them laughing on my couch in my living room while I was away working to support them both. Thought about her desperate calls I'd let ring in the dark. Thought about every lie she'd sold me so smoothly I'd started to doubt my own memory. I'm not just ready, I told Lisa. I'm looking forward to it. Let them see. Let everyone see exactly what comes back around when you betray someone who knows how to fight. Getting to Daniel Hudson directly was the next step, not to start something messy, but to fire a warning shot across the bow. To let him understand that the game had shifted, that he wasn't dealing with some oblivious husband anymore. He was dealing with someone who'd been trained for combat and didn't believe in doing things halfway. Using James's contacts and my knowledge of building systems and security layouts, I walked straight into Hudson Marketing Group dressed as a maintenance worker, worn toolbox, official-looking clipboard, a uniform that made me invisible to anyone who passed. Nobody looks twice at the repairman. I learned that years ago on job sites, confidence and purpose are the best disguise you can wear. Daniel's office was exactly what you'd expect from a man who mistakes expense for substance. $50,000 desk. Italian leather on every surface. Art on the walls that looked like it cost a fortune and meant absolutely nothing. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Denver, the kind of view that signals power to people who need that kind of signal. Daniel himself was on a call when I walked in, leaned back with his feet on the desk like he was the only important person on earth. The confusion on his face when he registered me would have been funny if I were in any mood to find it funny. He wrapped up his call fast, switching from confusion to irritation. Who are you? You can't be in here. I'm calling security. I closed his door behind me slowly, then crossed to his desk at my own pace and set a flash drive down next to his keyboard with a soft, deliberate click. My name is Alex Carter, I said, quiet and perfectly steady. I believe you're well acquainted with my wife. Megan. Quite intimately, in fact. Every drop of color left his face at once. He tried to recover, pasting on a calm he clearly didn't feel. I have no idea what you're referring to. I think you have me confused with someone else. I held up one hand to stop him. Don't. We're both too intelligent for that. On that drive, photographs of you and Megan across 4 different hotels over 3 months. Recordings of your phone conversations laying out your plans in detail. Time-stamped videos of you coming and going from those hotels on the exact days she told me she was working. Credit card records showing who paid for the rooms. Transcripts of over 3,000 text messages between your personal phone and hers. Emails where you two discuss not just your affair, but also confidential material she forwarded from my own private files. Every piece of it documented and organized in a way that would make any prosecutor in this state weep with gratitude. On that same drive is 7 years of your company's financial history, the offshore accounts and the Caymans you kept off the books. The shell company contracts you've been awarding yourself. The harassment settlements you paid out using company funds. The insider trading patterns. All of it. Meticulously documented. I've been very thorough, Daniel. Now he was genuinely frightened, that wall of arrogance finally crumbling. What do you want? Money? You want to be paid? Name a number. I could have laughed at how predictable it was. This has nothing to do with money. I'm not here to cut a deal. I'm here to give you a choice, one time, so pay attention. You can walk away quietly. End things with Megan immediately. Take the professional fallout heading your way without trying to drag her down harder than necessary. Cooperate when the time comes. And maybe, I keep the worst of what I know to myself. Maybe you just lose the corner office and the reputation instead of your freedom. And if that's not what I do? He asked, reaching for bravado and coming up short. I leaned forward over his desk, close enough that he had nowhere to look but at me. Then I reduce your entire world to rubble. The company, the reputation, the marriage, the freedom, everything. I make sure every partner, every client, every reporter in this city knows your full story. I make sure your wife learns about your other women, because Megan isn't the first, is she? I make sure your children find out who their father actually is. I show up and testify against you in person. I spend every cent I have ensuring you never work in this industry again. And that's before I hand it all over to the authorities and let them pick through what's left. Are we clear? I straightened up, picked up the empty toolbox, and headed for the door. I stopped with my hand on the frame. One more thing, if you warn Megan, if you try to get ahead of this or coordinate with her in any way, I'll know immediately. I have people watching you. Serious people. And I'll treat it as a declaration of war. Trust me when I say you do not want that. I learned from professionals. The door clicked shut behind me, and I walked out of that building knowing I'd just lit the fuse on something that was going to level everything they'd built together. Now I just had to wait for the blast. Patience was never a problem for me when the outcome was worth it. Megan grew more desperate by the day after that, like a creature that senses the trap tightening but can't figure out which direction the danger is coming from. She worked through every tool she had, dressed up in lingerie I hadn't seen in years, which I deflected with polite neutrality, picked fights over my distance, which I answered with nothing but calm, cried and apologized past the point where it could have mattered, which left me completely cold. She couldn't understand what had changed, why the patient, forgiving Alex she'd counted on for years had been replaced by this stranger who looked at her like she was already gone. She started trying to get into my finances, my email, my phone, growing increasingly frantic when she found every door locked, every password changed, every path blocked. IT professionals had helped me seal everything down tight. Every dead end she hit made her more erratic. I could see the panic building behind her eyes. The realization that whatever control she thought she had was gone, and she had no idea how to get it back. One afternoon I came home early on purpose to find her in my home office, digging frantically through a drawer of files. Fake files I'd deliberately placed and left unlocked, showing a business hemorrhaging money, debts I didn't owe, accounts that didn't exist, loans in free fall. When she looked up and found me standing in the doorway watching her, she didn't even bother pretending. The desperation had burned past shame. "What is going on, Alex?" she demanded, papers in her hands like she was holding evidence. "Where did the money go? Why is everything locked down? Why can't I access anything?" "I don't know what you mean," I said, perfectly innocent. "Everything is fine. Right where it should be." "Don't lie to me," she shouted, losing what was left of her composure. "My card got declined at Nordstrom today. You know how humiliating that was? The bank told me you moved everything into business accounts I'm not on. They said the house is in your name alone. When did that happen? What did you do?" "My company needed investment capital," I said, keeping my shrug casual. "Big growth opportunity. I'm sure it'll sort itself out, nothing you need to worry about." Her eyes narrowed and I could see the calculations running. "What company? Since when do you have a company? You're a contractor. You work for other people. Since I started taking my future seriously, I said evenly, letting her own words come back to her. You told me to pay more attention to my work, right? Stop being so predictable. Build something real. I'm just taking your advice, Megan. Being less boring. Building an empire while you were busy building your lies. She stared at me like she was meeting me for the first time. Maybe she was. The man she'd learned to walk all over, the one who apologized reflexively, absorbed her criticism without pushing back, bent himself into whatever shape she needed, was gone. Standing in his place was someone she couldn't read, couldn't manage, couldn't even begin to understand. And that terrified her more than anything else could have. You're punishing me, she said, and her voice had gone quiet. You know something. What do you know? No, I said, keeping my voice even and cold. I'm not punishing you. I'm protecting myself. Those are two completely different things. The final confrontation, the one I'd been orchestrating for weeks the way a conductor shapes every note before the performance, happened at Silver Peak Resort. James had intercepted an email Daniel carelessly sent from a work account giving me the exact dates. I booked my own room under a different name, paid cash, and left no footprint behind. I wasn't going up there to catch them in the act, that moment had passed. I went because I needed to finish this face-to-face, in the place where they felt safest. I drove up into the mountains alone on a Friday afternoon, winding roads cutting through thick pine, glimpses of snow-capped peaks between the trees. The resort was exactly the kind of place Megan loved, polished and exclusive and priced so high that regular people only ever read about it. 5-star dining, a spa with treatments that cost more than car payments, suites with views that belonged on magazine covers. All of it probably running through Daniel's company account, since Megan's personal credit had been quietly cratered by my very deliberate management of our shared finances. Getting into their suite was almost insulting in how simple it was. $50 to a housekeeper with no curiosity, and I had a key card and a room number. I waited until evening, until the last light was dying behind the mountains, until I knew they'd have settled in with their drinks and their guard fully down, feeling untouchable inside their bubble. Then I walked through their door like I'd paid the bill. They were out on the balcony, backlit by the last of the sunset, champagne catching the final light, looking like a scene from a luxury travel ad. Megan in a stunning black dress I'd never seen, bought for exactly this occasion with money she assumed was still partly hers. Daniel had his arm around her waist with the casual ownership of someone who thinks he's already won. They looked like people who'd never faced a consequence in their lives. Hell of a view, I said from the doorway, and my voice cut right through whatever moment they were sharing. Megan's glass slipped from her fingers and shattered across the balcony tiles, champagne spreading like something spilled at a crime scene. Daniel spun around fast, face moving through shock, then anger, then something that looked a lot like fear. Alex, Megan breathed, her voice barely forming the word. What are you doing here? How did you find us? I walked into the suite at my own pace, taking stock of everything around me with unhurried appreciation. Egyptian cotton sheets on a king-sized bed. A hot tub on the balcony. Vintage champagne in an ice bucket. Just wanted to see where my money was going. Where my wife's time was disappearing to. Nice choice. Very tasteful. Is that the Dom Perignon 08? Excellent selection. I hear it pairs well with broken vows and borrowed time. Daniel stepped forward, positioning himself between us, trying to summon the executive authority he used in conference rooms. Get out. Now. This is private property. I will call security. I smiled at him, and there was nothing friendly anywhere in it. What you need to do, Daniel, is stop talking and start listening. Because right now, as we're having this conversation, emails are being delivered to every member of your board detailing 7 years of financial crimes. By the time the sun comes up you'll be terminated, under federal investigation, and looking at criminal charges that carry real prison time. The blood left his face like a light being switched off. You're lying. You don't have anything. Already sent, I said, glancing at my watch. About 43 minutes ago. Lisa Martin doesn't do anything halfway. I'd check your phone. Something tells me it's having a very eventful evening. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands and what he found there wrecked him, notification after notification from board members, lawyers, partners, everyone scrambling at once. He kept scrolling, hoping it would stop, and it didn't. I watched the arrogance drain out of him in real time. Megan found her voice and it came out desperate and high-pitched. Alex, can we just talk? The two of us. Alone? We can work through this. Talk? I turned to face her, and whatever she saw when she looked at my eyes made her step back. The way we talked when you told me where you were going wasn't my concern? Or all those other times you looked me in the face and lied, about late nights, about business travel, about loving me, about keeping your vows? I do love you, she said, and tears started cutting through her makeup. Real ones, maybe. I no longer had the energy to care either way. You love what I provided, I said flatly. You love the house and the income and the fallback plan. The actual human being named Alex, the man you made vows to, him you never loved. Because love doesn't coexist with what you've done. Love doesn't look like this. Love requires basic respect. And you never had that for me. Not once in 7 years. Daniel had recovered enough of himself to try one more lunge. You think you're righteous? The hero? You're just a bitter man who couldn't hold his wife's attention, inadequate in every way that counted. I crossed the room before I even made the decision to move, grabbed him by the collar of his expensive shirt, and put him flat against the wall hard enough to rattle the framed art. I got my face close to his and dropped my voice almost to a whisper, and somehow that was more frightening than shouting. I could finish you right here and make it look like an accident. But that would be too fast. Too easy. Too merciful. I want you to watch your life come apart slowly. I want you to lose the company, the title, the freedom, the family, every single thing, one piece at a time. And I want you to remember me every single day you spend in prison. I want you to remember the man you thought wasn't worth worrying about. I let him go. He slid against the wall, every bit of fight gone, just a frightened man in an expensive suit that didn't fit the moment. I turned to Megan and pulled a folder from inside my jacket, dropping it onto the coffee table with a sound like a gavel. Divorce papers. Already filed. Already processed. You're walking away with nothing. Zero. The house is in my name, has been since before we married. Smart move, in hindsight. The car, the investments, the savings, the retirement accounts, all mine. You'll leave with whatever's in your personal checking, which was sitting at about $3,000 last I checked. That's not legal, she said, but her voice had no strength behind it. Community property. I have rights. Already done, I said pleasantly. Lisa Martin is handling it. You should find your own attorney, though I'll warn you, most reputable ones won't touch this case once they look at the details. You're being investigated for conspiracy to commit fraud, industrial espionage, and money laundering. Forwarding confidential documents from my files to your boss's competitors, that's a federal crime. Helping structure illegal offshore accounts, also a federal crime. Opening accounts in my name without my authorization, identity theft. You've been busy, Megan. Busier than I ever knew. Her legs gave out and she sat down hard on the couch, her perfect dress wrinkling, her mascara running in dark rivers down her face. I never meant for any of this to happen. I finished for her. But it did happen. And now both of you get to live inside what you built. I headed for the door. One more pause, one more turn. You remember that night you called me at 2 a.m? All those calls in a row? All those texts begging me to respond? I was in bed. Phone right beside me. I read every message as you sent them. And I made the deliberate choice to do nothing. To let you panic. To let you feel abandoned and ignored, because you had told me, in no uncertain terms, that where you went and what you needed and who you turned to were none of my business. I simply took your advice. I applied your philosophy. Turned out it worked just fine. The look on her face in that moment, the full weight of it landing all at once, was worth every sleepless hour I'd spent getting to this point. I walked out of that suite and drove back to Denver with the windows down and the music up, feeling lighter than I had in years. Like I could finally fill my lungs all the way. What followed was a spectacularly satisfying collapse. Daniel's company imploded within days. The board voted unanimously to remove him without severance. Criminal charges came fast after that, SEC investigations, IRS warrants, the whole machinery of consequence rolling over him at once. His wife filed for divorce immediately and took what she could before the legal battle stripped everything bare. Smart woman. Megan tried to contest the divorce. Borrowed money from her parents to hire an attorney, but going up against Lisa Martin with borrowed money was like bringing a kitchen knife to a gunfight. Her attempt to rally friends around her ran straight into the wall of social media. News about the affair and the federal investigation had already spread. The dinner party crowd suddenly stopped returning her calls. What I hadn't anticipated, what genuinely caught me off guard even though it probably shouldn't have, was how fast Daniel turned on her. When prosecutors showed up with plea offers tied to cooperation, he opened up completely. Gave them everything. Threw Megan so far under the bus she left a shadow. It was her, he told investigators, told lawyers, told anyone with ears. She manipulated me. She seduced me. She was the source, forwarding her husband's confidential information, suggesting the offshore structures, helping design the illegal transactions. She was the architect. I was just going along with what she'd set in motion. Megan hadn't seen that coming at all. The man she'd burned her life down for turned on her without blinking. Her attorney called my attorney begging for contradicting testimony. I laughed and hung up. She was on her own. The investigators found hundreds of emails she'd sent Daniel, forwarding documents I'd deliberately left accessible in my home office once I knew what she was doing. Financial projections, contract details, competitive intelligence. Months of it, all time-stamped, all provable. What she'd done had long since crossed the line from an affair into something considerably more serious. The day her criminal charges were filed, I was in Lisa's office signing the final divorce papers. Lisa's phone rang mid-signature, and the smile that spread across her face when she hung up told me everything before she said a word. "My contact at the DA's office," she said, barely containing herself. "Conspiracy to commit fraud, industrial espionage, money laundering, identity theft. If she's convicted on all counts, 10 to 15 years federal, possibly more if they add RICO." I signed the last page and nodded. "Daniel is facing 20 to 30, Lisa added. "Fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, tax evasion, obstruction." His plea deal collapsed when they caught him lying too many times. His lawyers are in full panic mode. It's genuinely beautiful. The house felt different once I changed the locks. Like it had been holding its breath for years and could finally let go. I brought in contractors to gut Megan's walk-in closet and turn it into a home gym, convert her bathroom into a sauna, strip her office down to the walls and build a library in its place. Every last trace of her was removed, donated, given away, or in some cases simply destroyed because the satisfaction was worth more than whatever it would have sold for. 3 weeks later it was as if she'd never set foot in the place. James came by one evening with a bottle of Macallan 25, the good stuff, reserved for moments that actually meant something. We sat out on the back deck watching the sun go down over the mountains in brilliant shades of orange and deep purple. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. He knew what it had cost me to get here. "You did what needed doing," he said finally, pouring us both a generous measure. "I know," I said. Not a single regret. 2 months after the divorce closed, Carter Steel Industries won its biggest contract yet, $65 million to supply custom metalwork for a new NFL stadium in Phoenix. Success, it turned out, was the most satisfying form of revenge available. While Daniel and Megan's worlds dissolved, mine was climbing to heights I hadn't planned for. 80 new employees. Offices in 5 states. Fortune 500 companies calling because they wanted to work with someone they could trust. 6 months out from the divorce, on a cold November evening that smelled like the first snow was coming, someone knocked on my door. I opened it to find Megan standing there, barely recognizable as the woman I'd spent 7 years married to. The designer clothes were gone. Worn jeans, a cheap jacket, hair limp around a face that had aged a decade in less than a year. Dark circles carved deep under her eyes. She looked like she'd been broken down to the frame. "Alex," she said, and her voice cracked on the single syllable. "Please. Just 5 minutes." I stood in the doorway without moving back. 2 minutes. "Starting now." She looked past me into the house, into what used to be hers, and I could see the tears forming. "I've lost everything. My job, my apartment, they repossessed my car. My friends won't talk to me. The trial starts next month and my attorney says I'm probably going to prison for 8 to 12 years. Daniel's legal team is painting me as the mastermind who engineered the whole thing and used him. Everything is gone, Alex. All of it. And you want what from me exactly?" My voice was somewhere below freezing. "Sympathy? Money for a better lawyer? A character witness? I want you to tell them the truth," she said, reaching toward me but not quite making contact. "Tell them I didn't understand what Daniel was doing. Tell them I was just having an affair and had no idea about the fraud. Tell them I was a victim too." I let out a short, harsh laugh. "That would be a lie, wouldn't it? You knew exactly what you were doing when you forwarded my documents. You knew what those offshore structures were. You helped open accounts in my name without my knowledge. You weren't an innocent bystander, you were a willing participant. An active one." "I was in love," she shouted, desperation cracking into anger. "I wasn't thinking straight. He told me we had a future together. Told me I was special. Told me he'd leave his wife and we'd build a life. I was stupid. I was wrong. But I don't deserve prison for falling for someone." "You were in love," I repeated, tasting each word. "So that's your defense. You destroyed our marriage, helped commit federal crimes, hurt everyone around you, but you were in love, so it shouldn't count. That's what you're going with." She dropped to her knees right there on my front step, grabbing both my hands with both of hers. "Please, Alex. Please. I will do anything. Pay you back however long it takes. Work for you. Sign whatever you need. I cannot go to prison. I won't survive it. Please. I looked down at her, this woman I'd once stood before and made promises to that I'd meant with everything I had. I remembered her laughing with Daniel in my own living room. Remembered her telling me my concerns weren't her problem. Remembered her calls ringing in the dark while I lay there and let them. Remembered every lie, every humiliation, every quiet moment she'd made me question my own sanity. I pulled my hands back and stepped away from her grip. You made your choices, Megan. Now you live with them. Same as I'm living with mine. You're really going to stand there and let me go to prison? She whispered. I'm not letting you do anything, I said, flat and final. You did this to yourself. Both of you. I only made sure you actually faced the consequences instead of buying your way out of them the way people like you usually do. I made sure accountability happened. That's all I did. I loved you, she said, her final card, played face up on the table. I know I didn't show it the way I should have. I know I hurt you badly. But I did love you once. And I think somewhere underneath all of this, part of you still loves me too. Otherwise, why would any of this hurt? I looked at her for a long moment, really looked, and felt absolutely nothing stir in the place where something used to live. You're wrong. I don't love you anymore. I don't hate you either. I don't feel anything for you at all. You're just a lesson now, a reminder of what happens when you mistake someone patient and principled for someone who'll never push back. Her face collapsed and she began sobbing, shaking, broken sobs that she couldn't control. Please, Alex. I have nowhere else to go. No one left to ask. You are the only option I have. No, I said, and it landed like a door closing. I'm not your option. I'm not your fallback. I'm not your husband. I'm just the man whose life you tried to dismantle, and the man who's walking back inside while you go face what you deserve. You're cruel, she spit, the grief curdling into something sharp. You're vindictive and hollow, and I hope you know that what you did to me, what you're doing right now, is worse than anything I ever did to you. You're a monster. I felt my jaw tighten. Felt heat flare for just a fraction of a second before the ice reasserted itself. You want to talk about cruel? You cheated on me for months. You brought him into our home while I was away making money that supported both of us. You helped him steal from people. You told me my feelings weren't your problem. And when you needed someone in the middle of the night, I did to you precisely what you had been doing to me all along. I treated you like you didn't matter. Because to me, by then, you didn't. You stopped mattering the moment you decided I wasn't worth your loyalty. I started closing the door and she grabbed the frame with both hands. I'll tell everyone what you did, how you engineered the whole thing, how you trapped us, how you manipulated every piece of this. I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are. Go ahead, I said easily. Tell them how I protected myself from a cheating spouse and a corrupt executive. Tell them how I documented the crimes and handed the evidence to the proper authorities. Tell them how I made sure actual justice happened. I'm sure that'll really help your case. Her hands dropped from the doorframe. All of it gone out of her at once. I hate you, she whispered. Good, I said. Now you know how it feels. Now we're square. I closed the door. Turned the deadbolt. Listened to her footsteps and her crying fade as she made her way down the driveway and out of my life. Then I walked to the living room, poured a drink, and sat down in the quiet of my home. My phone buzzed. James, saw her leave. You okay? I typed back, better than okay. It's done. Megan went to trial 4 months later. The evidence against her was overwhelming enough to bury any hope she had. Daniel testified against her under oath, cutting her loose at every opportunity to carve a few years off his own sentence. She was convicted on 7 of 9 counts and sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. Daniel received 22. Their great romance, that thrilling, world-burning love affair they thought justified everything, had lasted exactly 7 months. 7 months that cost both of them everything they had and everything they would ever have. Meanwhile, Carter Steel Industries kept climbing. 120 new employees. Offices in 8 states and 2 Canadian provinces. A downtown penthouse with views that made Daniel's old office look ordinary. I started seeing a structural engineer named Rachel, someone who heard my whole story and didn't blink, who understood that sometimes good people do hard things just to survive. 2 years after the divorce was finalized, we got married quietly, surrounded by people who actually knew us. No drama. No complications. Just 2 people deciding to build something real. When Megan's sister reached out years later asking if I'd write a character reference for a parole hearing, I declined. Politely but without ambiguity. Some things that get burned down were never meant to be rebuilt. Some decisions carry permanent weight. Some people spend their first chance like it cost them nothing, and that's why there isn't a second one. Standing on my penthouse balcony with Rachel beside me, company thriving, future wide open, I raised my glass one last time, not to forgiveness, not to closure, not to moving on.